In the autumn of 1842, railway navvies cutting through the London clay struck something that should not have existed. 40 feet down, in total darkness, their picks hit dressed stone instead of soil. What they found was sketched, briefly noted in private letters between engineers, then within days ordered back into the earth on instruction from men far above any foreman. No inquiry followed. No newspaper ran the account. The men were paid to stay quiet, and most of them did, for the rest of their lives. Tonight, we walk through what they found and why it disappeared so quickly. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? I always check the comments, and it is strange and lovely in equal measure. Someone in Manchester at 2 in the morning. Someone in Toronto just finishing dinner. Someone in Perth, Australia, waking up to find this video waiting for them after a night shift. All of us, scattered across time zones, listening to the same story about a hole in the ground in London that nobody was supposed to talk about. London, in 1842, was a city tearing itself apart and rebuilding itself at the same time. The railway had arrived less than 15 years earlier, and already it was reshaping the entire geography of Britain. Lines were being surveyed, funded, fought over in Parliament, and dug by hand through some of the oldest ground in England. The men who did the digging were called navvies, short for navigators, a term borrowed from the earlier era of canal building. They were among the hardest working and least documented labourers in British history. Thousands of them, many displaced from Ireland by famine and economic collapse, many more drawn from the English and Scottish countryside by wages that, brutal as the work was, beat anything available on a failing farm. They lived in shanty camps along the rail lines, moved with the work, drank hard, fought harder, and dug through hills, under rivers, and beneath the streets of London itself with nothing but picks, shovels, barrows, and an almost unimaginable tolerance for danger. The specific cutting we are concerned with tonight was part of an expansion linked to the growing network pushing toward the eastern approaches of the city, in an area where the ground dropped away into older floodplain clay, the kind of dense, waterlogged soil that engineers of the period both feared and respected. Cuttings of this depth were not unusual for the era. 40 feet was an ambitious but achievable target for a major cutting, especially where the engineers needed to keep gradients shallow enough for the heavy locomotives of the day. What was unusual was what stopped the digging entirely on the night in question. According to the fragments of testimony that survive, scattered across private letters, a handful of engineering notebooks, and one extraordinary account written decades later by a navvy's grandson who had inherited his grandfather's diary, the gang had been working a night shift to keep pace with a contractual deadline that was already slipping. Railway companies in this period operated under brutal time pressure. Investors expected lines completed on schedule, and delays cost staggering sums in penalty clauses and lost revenue. Night work, illuminated by oil lamps and the occasional bonfire at the cutting's edge, was common, dangerous, and exhausting. The lead ganger that night, a man whose name appears in payroll records simply as Tolliver, no first name recorded, had pushed his crew through a long stretch of unremarkable clay for most of the shift. The work was slow because the ground at that depth was waterlogged and prone to collapse, requiring constant shoring with timber as they advanced. It was, by every account, an unglamorous, grinding night of labour, the kind that left no trace in history except for the line itself eventually being built on top of it. Then, sometime in the deep hours of the night, a pick struck something that did not yield like clay. The man swinging it, according to the grandson's account, described the sound as wrong. Not the dull thud of metal into soil, not the crack of metal into a buried stone or root, but something resonant, almost hollow, as though the pick had struck a surface with space behind it. He called for the others. Lamps were brought closer. And there, embedded in the cutting wall at a depth the surveyors would later confirm as just over 40 feet, was a face of dressed stone, fitted block to block with a precision that immediately struck even unschooled labourers as deliberate, worked, built. This was not a natural rock formation. This was masonry. What happened over the following hours, and then the following days, is the story we are going to spend the rest of tonight unpacking slowly, carefully, piece by piece, because very little of it survives in a single clean account. Instead, it survives in fragments, in things half said and half remembered, in records that were altered, in payroll entries that don't add up, in a engineer's private journal that contradicts the official company history at almost every point. We are going to follow those fragments together, the way an investigator follows a cold case file, and by the end of tonight, you will understand not only what those navvies found in the London clay, but why the answer to what it was matters far more than anyone in 1842 wanted it to. Let's go back to that night, and let the ground tell its own story. The cutting sat in a stretch of ground that modern London has long since swallowed beneath warehouses, rail yards, and eventually housing estates, but in 1842 it was still semi-rural at its edges, the kind of transitional land where the expanding city met fields that had been farmed for centuries, sometimes longer. The soil here told its own geological story if you knew how to read it. Beneath a few feet of disturbed topsoil lay a thick band of London clay, blue, grey and dense, formed millions of years earlier when this entire region sat beneath a shallow tropical sea. Below that, in places, lay older deposits, sands and gravels left behind by ancient rivers that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Rivers that predated not just London but the entire human history of the British Isles as we understand it. For a navvy crew, this geology mattered enormously. Clay was workable but treacherous when wet, prone to sudden slumping that could bury a man in seconds. Gravel layers brought water, sometimes in alarming volumes, requiring constant pumping to keep the cutting dry enough to work. Engineers of the period had developed a reasonably sophisticated, if empirical, understanding of how to manage these conditions, shoring cuttings with timber frames, digging temporary drainage channels, working in stages rather than simply attacking the full depth in one continuous excavation. The crew working that night was excavating what the company's internal documents referred to as Section 11, a stretch of cutting that needed to reach a depth of approximately 42 feet to maintain the gradient specified by the chief engineer. They had been working this particular section for nearly 3 weeks, advancing slowly through increasingly difficult ground, and by the night in question, they were close to the target depth, perhaps within 2 or 3 feet by most estimates. The grandson's account, which forms the single most detailed surviving narrative of what happened, describes the moment with a clarity that suggests it had been told and retold many times within the family before it was finally written down. His grandfather, identified in the account only as Samuel, had been working the lower face of the cutting alongside 3 other men when his pick struck the stone. Samuel reportedly froze, not from fear exactly, but from the immediate and instinctive recognition that something was deeply wrong with what he had just felt and heard. He called the others over. One of them, a man whose nickname was apparently Birmingham Jack, on account of where he'd been recruited, was skeptical at first, assuming Samuel had simply hit a particularly large embedded stone, or perhaps an old foundation from some long-demolished farm building. This was not an unreasonable assumption. Cuttings of this era regularly turned up old foundations, wells, the occasional forgotten cellar from buildings that had vanished from living memory but left their stone bones behind in the earth. But as the men cleared away more of the surrounding clay with their hands and smaller tools, working carefully now rather than swinging picks, the scale of what they were uncovering became impossible to dismiss as a simple foundation. The stone face extended further than any farmhouse cellar wall would reasonably extend. It ran, as far as they could clear it that night, for what Samuel estimated at 12 to 15 feet horizontally before disappearing back into the unexcavated clay on either side. And critically, the blocks were fitted with a precision that none of these men, despite years of experience working with stone in various capacities, had seen in any structure they recognized as belonging to their own era or even the previous few centuries of English building. The mortar, where mortar existed at all, was minimal, almost an afterthought, as though the blocks had been cut to fit so precisely that extensive mortaring wasn't necessary to hold them in place. This is, worth noting, a hallmark of certain ancient construction techniques found across multiple continents and eras, where stones were dressed and fitted with such exactness that they functioned almost like a puzzle. locking together through sheer precision of cut rather than relying heavily on binding material. Whether the navvies understood the significance of this detail in the moment is impossible to know for certain, but Samuel's account, as relayed by his grandson, specifically mentions his confusion at how tightly the stones sat against one another and his comment that it looked more like something built by Romans than anything he'd ever seen an Englishman construct. The mention of Romans is significant, and we will return to it, because it represents the first and most natural explanation that occurred to the men on site, an explanation that the engineers who arrived later would also initially favour, and an explanation that would ultimately prove to be far too simple for what was actually beneath that London clay. Work stopped. This itself was an extraordinary decision, given the financial pressures bearing down on every railway project of this period. Time was money in the most literal sense, with penalty clauses attached to missed deadlines and investors watching every week of progress with intense scrutiny. For a ganger to halt an entire night shift's work was not a decision made lightly, and it tells us that whatever Tolliver saw when he came to inspect the find himself was significant enough to override the immense pressure to simply work around it, cover it, or ignore it entirely and press on toward the contracted depth. Tolliver's own brief and somewhat barely literate notation survives in a single payroll ledger entry that has been preserved more by accident than design, tucked into railway company archives that were eventually transferred to a regional record office decades later. The entry, dated to the appropriate week in question, simply reads that work on Section 11 was suspended due to, in his words, stone works found below, and that the matter had been reported to the resident engineer. It is a frustratingly terse entry for something that would prove to be so consequential, but it does at least corroborate the basic timeline that the grandson's account describes, lending crucial credibility to a story that might otherwise be dismissed as embellished family folklore passed down and exaggerated across generations. By morning, word had reached the site office, and within that same day, according to the account, a junior engineer arrived to inspect the find. This was standard practice. Engineers were expected to assess any unexpected obstruction, whether geological or man-made, that might affect the structural integrity of the cutting or require modification of the planned route. What was not standard was what happened next, because rather than simply assessing the stonework as an engineering obstacle to be worked around or removed, the junior engineer's reaction, as later described in his own private correspondence, was one of immediate and visible unease that went well beyond professional concern about construction delays. We'll meet this engineer properly in a moment, because his name, his background, and his subsequent career trajectory turn out to be essential pieces of understanding why this discovery was handled the way it was. But first, it's worth pausing to consider what we actually know, factually, about what these men found, stripped of speculation and presented as plainly as the surviving evidence allows. A stone structure, dressed and fitted with notable precision, was discovered at a depth of approximately 40 feet below the surface, in a railway cutting, being excavated through London clay in the autumn of 1842. The structure extended at least 12 to 15 feet horizontally as initially exposed, with its full extent unknown because excavation in that direction was deliberately not pursued. The construction technique, characterized by tight fitting of blocks with minimal mortar, was unfamiliar to the experienced laborers who encountered it, several of whom had worked on demolition and construction projects involving genuinely ancient Roman remains elsewhere in London, remains that were, in fact, being discovered with some regularity during this exact period of urban expansion and excavation. This last point deserves particular emphasis. London, in the early to mid-19th century, was undergoing an unprecedented wave of construction, and with it, an unprecedented wave of archaeological discovery, almost entirely accidental and almost entirely undocumented by any formal archaeological process, since the discipline of archaeology, as we now understand it, barely existed as an organized field. Roman walls, Roman pavements, Roman artifacts of every description were being unearthed across the city as new foundations were dug, new sewers laid, new railway cuttings carved through ground that had been continuously inhabited and built upon for nearly 2,000 years. This meant that the navvies and engineers working on projects like this one were not naive about the possibility of encountering ancient remains. Quite the opposite. They had, by this point in London's railway building boom, developed something approaching a working familiarity with what Roman construction looked like when it turned up beneath the modern city. Roman walls, typically built using a technique that mixed rubble core with a dressed stone or brick facing, were recognizable by their general method, their typical depth of burial, and their characteristic materials. This is precisely why Samuel's initial comparison to Roman construction is so important, and precisely why the engineers' subsequent reaction matters so much, because what they found did not, upon closer examination, actually match what experienced observers expected Roman remains to look like. It was something else. And the question of exactly what that something else might have been is the thread we are going to follow for the rest of this story. The junior engineer's name was Edmund Halloway, and at the time of the discovery, he was 26 years old, 3 years into a promising career with the railway company, having trained under one of the more respected civil engineers of the era before striking out to oversee his own sections of line. Halloway was, by every surviving account of his professional reputation, methodical, careful, and notably uninterested in anything resembling sensationalism. He was not a man prone to flights of imagination or given to seeing significance where none existed. This matters enormously for our story, because it means that when Halloway's private correspondence describes a reaction of genuine alarm upon viewing the stonework, we should take that alarm seriously, rather than dismissing it as the overactive imagination of a young man unfamiliar with the realities of underground construction. Halloway's letters survive primarily because of an accident of family history. He corresponded regularly with his older sister, who had married into a family with strong archival habits, the kind of Victorian household that kept every letter, every receipt, every scrap of correspondence in carefully labelled boxes that were passed down through generations largely intact. It was through this collection, eventually donated to a regional historical society by a descendant in the 20th century, that researchers gained access to a series of letters Halloway wrote to his sister across the autumn and winter of 1842, letters that document his growing unease with the entire situation surrounding the Section 11 discovery. His first letter on the subject, written within 2 days of his initial inspection of the site, describes the stonework in terms that immediately distinguish it from typical Roman remains. He writes of the blocks being, in his words, of an order and a precision that he had not encountered in any antiquarian description he had read, nor in any structure he had personally observed during his training, which had included exposure to several genuine Roman sites uncovered during earlier construction projects in the city. He specifically notes that the stone itself appeared to be of a type not readily available in the immediate region, a detail that would prove enormously significant later, though at this early stage he records it almost as an aside, a curiosity rather than a central concern. What troubled Halloway more immediately, based on the tone and content of his letters, was the configuration of the structure itself. He describes what he calls a chamber, though he qualifies this term carefully, noting that only a portion of it had been exposed and that its full shape and purpose remained entirely unclear. The exposed stonework appeared to curve, suggesting either a circular or elliptical structure, rather than the straight walls one would expect from a typical Roman building foundation, fortification wall, or the kind of rectangular chamber tombs and storage structures that were the most commonly encountered Roman remains in London at this time. A curved stone structure at 40 feet depth, constructed with a precision that exceeded known Roman techniques, using stone that did not match local geology. These 3 details, taken together, were enough to push Halloway from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine disquiet, and it is in his second letter, written perhaps a week after the discovery, that we get our clearest window into just how seriously he was taking the matter. He writes that he had taken the unusual step of consulting privately with an acquaintance who had some background in antiquarian studies, a gentleman amateur of the kind that populated much of what passed for archaeological scholarship in this period, since formal university-trained archaeology essentially did not yet exist as a profession. This acquaintance, whom Halloway refers to only by the initial W throughout his correspondence, apparently visited the site discreetly, examined what had been exposed, and offered an opinion that clearly rattled Holloway considerably, because his letter describing the visit is notably more guarded and circumspect than his earlier correspondence, as though he were choosing his words with unusual care, even in a private letter to his own sister. He writes, and this is worth quoting as closely as the surviving transcription allows, that his friend W had examined the stonework with great interest and had remarked that he had seen similar construction described in accounts from explorers and travellers returning from distant parts of the world, accounts of ancient structures predating any civilization presently known to scholarship, structures whose builders remained entirely unidentified despite considerable speculation. Holloway notes that W seemed both fascinated and troubled by this comparison, and that he had strongly advised Holloway to document everything as thoroughly as possible before, in his words, "The matter is taken out of your hands," a phrase that Holloway himself underlines in the letter, suggesting he found it as ominous as we might today, reading it nearly 2 centuries later. This is the first hint in the surviving record that someone, somewhere, anticipated that the discovery would be suppressed before any actual suppression had occurred. W's warning suggests either remarkable prescience or, more likely, a familiarity with how such discoveries had been handled in the past, a pattern of behavior by authorities and institutions when faced with finds that complicated, established historical narratives or raised questions that those in positions of power preferred to leave unasked. Who exactly was W? This question has occupied researchers interested in this case for decades, and while no definitive identification has ever been confirmed, there are several intriguing candidates among the gentlemen antiquarians and amateur scholars active in London during this period. Men who moved in overlapping circles of scientific societies, private clubs, and informal correspondence networks that connected serious amateur researchers across the country, and, in some cases, across Europe and beyond. Some researchers have speculated that W may have had connections to the broader and increasingly contentious debates happening within geological and antiquarian circles during this exact period regarding the age of the Earth, the timeline of human civilization, and the uncomfortable possibility that conventional historical chronology, based heavily on biblical timelines that placed the entirety of human history within roughly 6,000 years, might be fundamentally incomplete or incorrect. This context matters enormously for understanding the broader intellectual environment into which this discovery emerged. The 1840s were a period of intense and often bitter conflict between emerging scientific evidence, particularly in geology, and established religious and historical orthodoxy. Geologists like Charles Lyell had already begun publishing work that suggested the Earth was vastly older than traditional biblical chronology allowed, work that was deeply controversial and actively resisted by significant portions of the scientific and religious establishment. Discoveries of fossils, of ancient human tools found alongside extinct animal remains, of geological strata that seemed to require timescales far longer than a few thousand years to form, were beginning to accumulate in ways that threatened to upend not just specific historical claims, but the entire framework through which educated Victorians understood human history and humanity's place within the broader story of the planet. Into this already tense intellectual atmosphere, a discovery of advanced stone construction at 40 feet depth, predating any known historical period, and constructed using techniques that didn't match any recognized ancient civilization, would have been, to put it mildly, unwelcome. It is within this context that we need to understand the subsequent decisions made by the railway company and, as we will see, by figures considerably more powerful than any railway executive, regarding what should happen to Holloway's discovery. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we follow the chain of decisions that led to the structure being reburied, we need to understand more precisely what was actually found, because the details matter enormously, and they have been distorted, exaggerated, and in some cases deliberately obscured by nearly 2 centuries of retelling, speculation, and in more recent decades, the kind of internet-driven embellishment that tends to accumulate around any historical mystery once it escapes the narrow confines of specialist research and enters wider popular consciousness. Let's slow down and examine the physical evidence as carefully and as soberly as the surviving sources allow. What we know about the physical characteristics of the structure comes from three primary sources, each with its own limitations and biases that need to be acknowledged before we proceed. The first is Samuel's account, as preserved through his grandson's later written record. The second is Halloway's private correspondence with his sister. The third, and in many ways the most frustrating, is a brief and heavily redacted entry in the formal company records, the official documentation that the railway company itself produced and retained, records that were clearly edited or sanitized at some point before being archived, since they contain obvious gaps, oddly worded passages, and at least one instance where a page has been physically removed from the bound ledger, with only a stub remaining to show where it once existed. Let's begin with the stone itself, since this detail proves to be one of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the entire case. Halloway, in his second letter, notes that the stone did not appear to be of Kentish ragstone, nor Portland, nor any variety I have encountered in the foundations of this city. This is a significant observation coming from a trained engineer who would have had extensive practical familiarity with the building stones commonly used and commonly encountered in London construction. Kentish ragstone, a hard limestone quarried in Kent, had been used extensively by the Romans themselves for construction in London, making it one of the most commonly encountered stone types in genuine Roman remains uncovered throughout the city during this period of intensive excavation. Portland stone, the famous white limestone from Dorset, was the dominant building material for Grand Georgian and Victorian construction throughout London, used in everything from St. Paul's Cathedral to countless civic buildings. An engineer of Halloway's background and experience would have been intimately familiar with both, able to recognize them essentially on site. His explicit statement that the stone matched neither of these, nor any other variety he recognized, raises an immediate and obvious question: where did it come from? Stone of this nature, dressed and transported to a building site, represented enormous labor and expense in any historical period prior to modern mechanized transport. The Romans themselves had extensive supply chains for building stone, often transporting material considerable distances by river and road when local stone wasn't suitable for their purposes. But even Roman supply networks operated within recognizable geological and logistical constraints. If the stone at Section 11 didn't match any locally available variety, and didn't match the stone types the Romans were known to have imported into the London area, then its origin becomes a genuine mystery, one that has never been satisfactorily resolved because, as we will see, no sample of the stone survives for modern geological analysis. Everything was reburied, and as far as any surviving record indicates, nothing was ever removed from the site for testing or preservation. This absence of physical samples is, frankly, the single greatest obstacle to definitively resolving what this structure actually was. Without a fragment of stone to analyze, without the ability to apply modern dating techniques, modern geological sourcing analysis, modern archaeological methodology of any kind, we are left entirely dependent on the observations of 19th century laborers and engineers, however careful and credible those observations might be. This is precisely the kind of evidentiary gap that makes historical mysteries like this one simultaneously fascinating and frustrating, because there is no way to move from circumstantial and testimonial evidence to anything approaching scientific certainty. The second crucial detail concerns the shape and configuration of the exposed structure. As mentioned previously, both Samuel's account and Halloway's letters describe curved stonework rather than the straight walls typical of most Roman construction. This curvature is described with slightly different details across the two sources, which is itself informative, since it suggests independent observation rather than a single narrative being copied or embellished by one source from the other. Samuel's account, as relayed by his grandson, describes the curve as quite pronounced, comparing it at one point to the inside of a large barrel or cistern, suggesting a tightly curved structure with a relatively small radius. Halloway's correspondence describes the curve as more gradual, more consistent with what he speculates might be a large circular chamber, or perhaps a section of a substantial circular wall, the kind of structure one might associate with a large tower, a well of unusual dimensions, or some kind of ceremonial or astronomical structure of the type, increasingly being documented by explorers and antiquarians studying ancient sites in other parts of the world. This discrepancy between the two accounts is not necessarily a contradiction. It's entirely plausible that what Samuel observed up close, from the perspective of a labourer working directly against the stone face with a lamp providing limited illumination, would appear different from what Halloway observed during his more removed inspection, particularly if the engineer had access to better lighting and the ability to step back and view a larger section of the exposed surface. Taken together, the two accounts suggest a curved structure of considerable size, large enough that its true diameter and overall shape could not be determined from the limited excavation that occurred before work was halted. The third significant detail, and perhaps the most evocative, concerns markings that both Samuel and Halloway separately describe on portions of the exposed stone. Samuel's account mentions what he calls scratches or marks that didn't appear to be random damage or weathering, but seemed deliberate, arranged in patterns that he couldn't make sense of, but that struck him as clearly intentional rather than accidental. He apparently traced one of these patterns with his finger before the structure was reburied, though his grandson's account doesn't provide enough detail for us to know whether this represented actual symbolic carving, decorative tooling marks from the construction process itself, or something else entirely. Halloway's correspondence is, frustratingly, more circumspect on this exact point, which itself is suspicious given how forthcoming he was about other details. In his second letter, he mentions, almost in passing, that there were certain markings upon the stone, which I have sketched as best I am able, though I confess my draftsmanship does the subject little justice. This is a tantalizing reference because it implies that Halloway actually produced a sketch of these markings, a sketch that, if it survived, would represent the single most valuable piece of physical evidence available to modern researchers attempting to understand this case. Unfortunately, no such sketch has ever been located, despite extensive searching through the surviving family archive that preserved his letters. It's possible the sketch was included with the letter and subsequently lost or damaged over the following century and a half of storage. It's possible Halloway never actually sent it, keeping it instead with other professional papers that did not survive. Or, and this possibility cannot be entirely dismissed, given everything else we know about how this case was handled, it's possible the sketch was deliberately removed or destroyed at some point, either by Halloway himself under pressure from his employers, or by some later party who recognized its significance and chose to ensure it would never see wider circulation. What we are left with, then, is a description without an image. Markings on ancient stone, deliberate rather than random, sketched by a careful and credible engineer who explicitly noted his own limitations as an artist, but nonetheless considered the markings significant enough to attempt to document them at all. This single detail, more than almost any other in this entire case, has fueled decades of speculation among researchers and amateur investigators who have encountered this story, because deliberate markings on ancient stone immediately raise the possibility of writing, of symbolic communication, of some kind of message or record left by whoever constructed this structure, a message that might have told us, definitively, who they were and when they built what these navvies stumbled upon in the London clay. We will return to the question of these markings later in our story, because there is one more piece of testimony, considerably more obscure and considerably more difficult to verify, that adds an additional and genuinely unsettling layer to this particular detail. But before we get there, we need to follow the chain of events that led from Halloway's growing unease to the formal decision, made at a level well above his own authority, that the structure needed to be concealed once again beneath the London clay. The railway companies of Victorian Britain operated within a corporate structure that, while primitive by modern standards, nonetheless involved multiple layers of authority between a junior engineer like Halloway and the board of directors who ultimately controlled the company's resources, reputation, and strategic decisions. Understanding this structure is essential to understanding how a discovery made by labourers at the bottom of a literal hole in the ground could eventually attract the attention and intervention of people operating at the very highest levels of British society. Halloway's immediate superior was the resident engineer for that section of the line, a man named Cuthbert Ashworth, whose own surviving records are considerably more sparse than Halloway's, consisting primarily of formal company correspondence, rather than the kind of candid personal letters that make Halloway's account so valuable. What we know of Ashworth comes largely through the lens of how Halloway describes him in his own letters, and the picture that emerges is of a competent, somewhat cautious senior engineer who was acutely aware of the financial and political pressures bearing down on every aspect of railway construction during this period, and who therefore approached the discovery with considerably more wariness than enthusiasm from the very beginning. According to Halloway's third letter to his sister, written perhaps 10 days after the initial discovery, Ashworth visited the site personally after receiving Halloway's report, accompanied by two other men whom Halloway does not name, but describes only as gentlemen of evident standing, though not, I think, engineers. This phrase has been passed and repassed by researchers studying this case for what it might reveal about who these visitors actually were. Halloway's careful wording suggests he recognized something in their bearing or manner that marked them as men of social and perhaps institutional importance, despite the fact that they apparently displayed no particular technical engineering knowledge during their inspection of the site. This detail matters because it represents the first documented intrusion of outside authority into what had, until this point, remained a relatively contained engineering matter handled within the normal chain of command of the railway company itself. The question of who these gentlemen were, and on whose authority they came to inspect a stalled railway excavation, has never been definitively answered, but the surviving circumstantial evidence points towards several plausible possibilities, each of which illuminates something important about how Victorian institutions handled discoveries that threatened to complicate accepted understandings of history, religion, and Britain's place within a divinely ordained historical narrative that still held enormous cultural and political power during this period. The most straightforward possibility is that these were representatives of the Society of Antiquaries, the venerable institution responsible for overseeing matters of historical and archaeological significance in Britain, an institution with close ties to both the scientific establishment and the aristocracy. Since its membership roles during this period were dominated by wealthy gentlemen scholars rather than the kind of professional, university-trained archaeologists who would only begin to dominate the field many decades later. If the Society of Antiquaries had been informed of a significant discovery, it would have been entirely consistent with their role and historical practice to dispatch representatives to assess the find, and it would explain why these visitors displayed antiquarian interest rather than engineering expertise. A second possibility, considerably more speculative but supported by certain details in the surviving correspondence, involves the railway company's own board of directors and their close connections to government and aristocratic circles. Railway companies of this period were financed and governed by an interlocking network of wealthy industrialists, members of parliament, and aristocratic landowners whose estates the new rail lines often crossed, requiring delicate negotiation and compensation arrangements. A discovery that threatened to delay construction, generate unwelcome publicity, or raise uncomfortable questions about Britain's ancient history would have been a matter of direct financial and political concern to these men, and it would not be surprising if word of the discovery travelled quickly through these elite social networks, prompting a more direct and less formally documented form of intervention than would have occurred through official antiquarian channels. A third possibility, and the one that the surviving evidence most strongly suggests based on subsequent events, involves a more direct connection to the Church of England's interests in matters of historical chronology and the ongoing, increasingly fraught public debate over the age of the Earth and the accuracy of biblical historical timelines. We've already discussed how the 1840s represented a period of intense intellectual conflict between emerging geological and archaeological evidence and traditional religious chronology. A discovery suggesting the existence of an advanced, unidentified civilization predating any recognized historical period would have represented precisely the kind of evidence that threatened to inflame this already volatile debate, and it would not be surprising if church authorities, either directly or through intermediaries within their extensive social and political networks, took an active interest in ensuring that such evidence did not reach wider public attention before its implications could be carefully managed, or, more likely, simply suppressed. Whatever the precise identity and institutional affiliation of these visitors, Halloway's account makes clear that their visit marked a turning point in how the discovery was handled. His fourth letter, written perhaps 2 weeks after the initial discovery, describes a noticeably changed atmosphere at the site. Ashworth, his immediate superior, had become considerably more guarded in his communications, instructing Halloway to limit further excavation in the area and to refer any inquiries about the matter, including from other railway company personnel, directly to himself, rather than discussing the discovery openly, as had apparently been happening among the engineering staff in the immediate aftermath of the find. More tellingly, Halloway describes being asked to provide a written report of his observations, a request that on its surface seems entirely reasonable and consistent with normal engineering practice, but which Halloway's letter frames with evident unease. He writes that he was instructed to be, in his words, measured and cautious in his language, and specifically to avoid, again in his own words, speculation as to the antiquity or origin of the structure, confining myself strictly to its physical dimensions and the practical engineering considerations it presents. This instruction, explicitly discouraging any discussion of the structure's possible age or origin, represents a clear and deliberate effort to control the narrative surrounding the discovery before it had even been fully documented, let alone investigated. Halloway complied, at least in his official report, which survives in heavily redacted form within the company archives. But his private letters to his sister, written around this same period, reveal a man increasingly troubled not just by the discovery itself, but by the manner in which it was being handled by his superiors. In one particularly striking passage, he writes that he found himself, in his words, uncertain whether I am engaged in honest engineering work or in the concealment of something which the public has every right to know, a remarkably candid admission from a young man whose entire career and livelihood depended on maintaining the goodwill of his employers. This internal conflict between professional obligation and what appears to have been a genuine personal conviction that something important was being wrongfully hidden would ultimately shape the remainder of Halloway's involvement in this case, and as we will see, it may well have shaped the remainder of his career and life in ways that extend well beyond this single incident. But before we follow Halloway's personal story further, we need to address the central question that his superiors were apparently so determined to prevent him from publicly exploring. What, precisely, did this structure actually represent, and why would its true nature have been considered so dangerous that it warranted this level of institutional intervention? To answer that question, we need to step back from the specific details of the 1842 discovery and place it within a much broader context, a context involving other discoveries, other suppressed findings, and a pattern of behavior by Victorian institutions when confronted with evidence that complicated the comfortable historical narrative they had constructed around Britain's ancient past and humanity's place within a divinely sanctioned and relatively brief span of recorded history. To understand why the discovery at Section 11 might have triggered such a swift and coordinated response, we need to understand that this was not, in fact, an isolated incident. The historical record, fragmentary and frustrating as it often is, contains numerous other examples from this same general period of British history in which discoveries that complicated established chronologies or challenged comfortable assumptions about human history were quietly minimized, reinterpreted to fit existing frameworks, or in some documented cases, deliberately concealed from public knowledge entirely. Consider, for instance, the broader context of what was happening in British geology and paleontology during precisely this decade. Throughout the 1840s, a series of discoveries involving stone tools found in direct association with the bones of extinct animals that had vanished from Britain many thousands of years before the biblically sanctioned date for the creation of the world, were beginning to accumulate in the hands of serious researchers. These findings presented an enormous problem for the established scientific and religious consensus because they suggested that human beings, or at least tool-using hominids of some kind, had existed in Britain for a span of time vastly exceeding the few thousand years allowed by traditional biblical chronology, which most educated Victorians, including many scientists, still accepted as broadly accurate, well into the middle of the 19th century. The response of the scientific establishment to this accumulating evidence was, for decades, one of active resistance and minimization. Researchers who proposed that human antiquity extended far beyond biblical timelines were frequently marginalized, their findings dismissed or reinterpreted by more established figures within scientific societies who had enormous personal and institutional investment in maintaining the existing chronological framework. It would take until the late 1850s and into the 1860s, with the cumulative weight of evidence becoming simply too overwhelming to ignore, before the scientific establishment began to seriously and publicly grapple with the implications of what we now call deep time, the recognition that human history and the history of the Earth itself extended back not thousands but potentially millions of years. Against this backdrop, a discovery in 1842 of an apparently advanced stone structure built with techniques unfamiliar to contemporary engineers, buried at a depth that itself suggested enormous antiquity, given the rate at which sediment accumulates in this kind of geological context, would have represented an almost uniquely dangerous piece of evidence. It wasn't simply a stone tool that could be dismissed as a curious anomaly or reinterpreted within existing frameworks. It was a structure, implying organized labor, planned construction, and a level of technical sophistication that demanded an explanation for who built it and when, an explanation that the available historical and religious framework of 1842 Britain simply could not comfortably provide. This is precisely the kind of evidence that institutional authorities of this period had both the motive and, crucially, the practical ability to suppress. Unlike a published scientific paper, which once circulated could not easily be unwritten or unread, a physical discovery at the bottom of a private construction site, witnessed by a small number of working-class laborers and a handful of company engineers, could be controlled, managed, and ultimately erased with relative ease, provided the right combination of financial incentive, institutional pressure, and simple physical reburial was applied quickly enough before word of the discovery could spread beyond the immediate circle of people directly involved. This brings us to a series of payments that appear scattered through the railway company's financial records from this exact period, payments that, taken individually, might seem unremarkable, but which, when examined collectively and in context, paint a fairly clear picture of a deliberate and well-organized effort to ensure silence among everyone who had witnessed the discovery. The payroll records for the relevant period show a series of what are labeled as special disbursements made to the crew working Section 11, disbursements that significantly exceeded their normal wages for the period in question. This in itself might be explained innocently, perhaps as compensation for the additional hazardous work involved in clearing and then reburying the discovery, or as an incentive to maintain the construction schedule despite the disruption caused by the find. But the timing and pattern of these payments, combined with what we know from Samuel's account about explicit instructions given to the crew regarding discretion about what they had seen, suggests something more deliberate than simple hazard pay. Samuel's grandson's written record includes a detail that has often been treated with some skepticism by researchers examining this case, precisely because it sounds almost too neat, too convenient a piece of corroborating evidence. According to this account, Samuel and the other men present at the discovery were gathered together by Tolliver, the ganger, within a few days of the find, and informed, in fairly blunt terms, that they were to speak of what they had seen to no one outside their immediate work crew, that doing so would result in immediate dismissal and the loss of any further work with the company, and that in exchange for their continued silence, they would each receive what the account describes as a sum equal to near a month's wages, paid in addition to their normal earnings for the period. This kind of arrangement, while undocumented in any formal company record that survives, would have been entirely consistent with labor practices of the period, in which workers possessed essentially no legal protections, no formal recourse against arbitrary dismissal, and a near total dependence on the goodwill of employers who held enormous and largely unchecked power over their livelihoods. A simple threat of dismissal, particularly during a period of intense competition for railway construction jobs as multiple companies competed for the limited pool of experienced navvies, would have been more than sufficient to ensure compliance from most workers, even without the additional financial incentive that Samuel's account describes. What's particularly notable, and what lends additional credibility to this account, is that Samuel apparently did maintain his silence for the remainder of his working life, only confiding the details of what he had witnessed to his family late in his life, decades after the events in question, and explicitly instructing his grandson that the account should not be shared more widely until after his own death, suggesting that even in his final years, Samuel retained a genuine and apparently persistent fear of consequences should his testimony become public knowledge. This is frankly an extraordinary level of caution to maintain across an entire lifetime regarding a single incident from one's youth, and it strongly suggests that whatever threats or warnings were issued to the crew in 1842 were taken with genuine seriousness, the kind of seriousness that doesn't simply fade with the passage of decades. But the navvies were not the only people whose silence needed to be secured. Halloway, as a salaried professional engineer with a career and reputation to protect, represented a different kind of risk entirely, one that could not be managed through simple threats of dismissal in the same way as unskilled labourers. The question of how the railway company, or whoever was ultimately directing this effort at suppression, managed to secure Halloway's continued discretion, and what eventually happened to him as a result of his involvement in this affair, takes us into some of the most genuinely tragic and unresolved territory in this entire story. Edmund Halloway's subsequent career trajectory, when examined against the backdrop of his obvious talent and the promising start he had made in his profession, presents a genuinely puzzling pattern, one that researchers studying this case have repeatedly pointed to as circumstantial but compelling evidence that his involvement in the Section 11 discovery had lasting and largely negative consequences for his professional life. Prior to the autumn of 1842, Halloway's career had followed a trajectory that suggested a bright future within the railway engineering profession. He had trained under a respected senior engineer, had been entrusted with independent responsibility for sections of line at a relatively young age, and his surviving correspondence demonstrates a level of technical competence and careful, methodical thinking that would have made him an attractive candidate for increasing responsibility within the rapidly expanding railway industry, an industry that was, during this exact period, experiencing such explosive growth that talented young engineers were in constant and often desperate demand. Yet the historical record shows that Halloway's career essentially stalled following the events of 1842. He remained with the same railway company for several more years, but in positions of diminishing rather than increasing responsibility, eventually being transferred to a series of relatively minor provincial projects, far removed from the major metropolitan construction efforts, where the most prestigious and career-advancing work was concentrated. By the early 1850s, his name disappears from the company's surviving employment records entirely, and subsequent efforts by researchers to trace his later life and career have yielded frustratingly incomplete results. What we do know comes from a combination of genealogical records and a final handful of surviving letters to his sister, letters that become increasingly sparse and increasingly guarded in their content as the years progress. In a letter dated several years after the Section 11 incident, Halloway writes, with evident bitterness, that he believes his career prospects have been deliberately constrained, though he stops short of explicitly connecting this to the events of 1842, perhaps out of continued caution about committing such an accusation to writing, even in a private letter to a trusted family member. He mentions, somewhat cryptically, that he has come to understand that certain doors, once closed, do not reopen easily, for a man who has seen what he ought not to have seen. A phrase that, while characteristically oblique, strongly suggests his own belief that his diminished career prospects were a direct consequence of his role in documenting and then being forced to remain silent about the discovery. Genealogical records suggest that Halloway eventually left railway engineering entirely, sometime in the mid-1850s, taking up a considerably less prestigious position in a provincial municipal engineering office, work focused on relatively mundane matters of drainage, water supply, and local infrastructure, far removed from the ambitious and high-profile railway projects that had defined the early years of his career. He married relatively late for a man of his social position, had 2 children, and appears to have lived out the remainder of his life in comfortable but unremarkable circumstances, dying in his early 60s, according to the death record researchers have located, a death that appears to have been from natural causes, with nothing in the surviving record suggesting any suspicious circumstances surrounding his eventual demise. This trajectory, while frustratingly inconclusive in terms of providing definitive proof of deliberate career sabotage, is nonetheless consistent with a pattern that researchers familiar with how Victorian institutions handled inconvenient witnesses to suppress discoveries have noted across multiple similar cases. Rather than resorting to more dramatic or legally risky measures, such as outright dismissal that might have prompted Holloway to seek other employment and potentially speak more openly about his reasons for leaving, the more common pattern appears to have involved a gradual, almost imperceptible marginalization, a slow redirection of career opportunities away from positions of visibility and influence, ensuring that the individual in question remained employed, remained financially dependent on the goodwill of powerful institutional connections, and therefore remained motivated to maintain discretion without ever creating the kind of clear, documentable grievance that might have prompted more dramatic public action. It's worth pausing here to consider what this pattern, if accurately interpreted, tells us about the seriousness with which this discovery was treated by those who orchestrated its suppression. The effort to ensure Holloway's continued silence appears to have extended across years, not simply the immediate aftermath of the discovery itself, suggesting a sustained institutional commitment to preventing the truth about Section 11 from ever reaching wider public attention, a commitment that persisted long after any immediate practical concern about construction delays or public relations would have naturally faded. This brings us to what is, in many ways, the most genuinely mysterious and difficult to verify element of this entire case: the question of what actually happened during the physical process of reburial itself, and specifically, the persistent rumors and fragmentary testimony suggesting that something more than simple backfilling occurred at Section 11 before the cutting was allowed to proceed. According to Samuel's account, the reburial took place over the course of a single night, conducted by a smaller and notably different crew than the one that had made the original discovery. This detail alone is significant, because it suggests a deliberate effort to limit the number of people who would witness whatever process was involved in concealing the structure, beyond simply backfilling the excavated portion of the cutting with the clay that had originally been removed. Samuel himself was not part of this reburial crew, having apparently been reassigned, along with most of the original discovery crew, to other sections of the line in the days following the initial find. But he records, in the account preserved by his grandson, having spoken with one of the men who was involved in the reburial work, a conversation that apparently took place some time later, after both men had moved on to other projects and felt somewhat more comfortable discussing what had happened, at least privately among themselves, even if they continued to maintain public silence about the matter. This second-hand account, filtered through Samuel's memory and then through his grandson's later written record, describes the reburial crew working not merely to backfill the excavated area, but to first complete a more thorough excavation and clearing of the exposed stone surface, apparently under the direct supervision of several of the same unidentified gentlemen who had visited the site earlier. This detail, if accurate, suggests that before the structure was concealed once again, it was subjected to some kind of more careful examination, possibly including measurement, sketching, or even the removal of certain materials or artifacts from the site. Activities that would explain why the gentlemen visitors wanted the area more fully exposed before the final reburial took place, rather than simply ordering the immediate covering of whatever had already been uncovered by the original discovery crew. If this account is accurate, and we should treat it with appropriate caution given that it represents testimony filtered through at least 2 layers of retelling across multiple decades, it raises a genuinely fascinating possibility that whatever was removed from the site during this more thorough final examination might still exist somewhere, perhaps within a private collection, perhaps within the archives of whatever institution ultimately orchestrated this entire affair, waiting to be rediscovered by researchers who don't yet know what they're looking for or where to look. This possibility, however speculative, brings us to a crucial turning point in our investigation because it requires us to step back and ask a broader question. If this structure was indeed something genuinely unprecedented, something that didn't match known Roman construction or any other recognized ancient civilization active in Britain during the historical periods conventionally accepted by scholarship, what exactly might it have been? To answer that question, we need to look beyond the specific details of this single discovery and examine a broader pattern of similarly anomalous findings, both in Britain and around the world, that share striking and, in some cases, genuinely difficult to explain similarities with what was found beneath the London clay in 1842. To properly contextualize the Section 11 discovery, we need to step back nearly 7,000 years and consider what archaeologists and geologists actually know, with reasonable confidence, about human activity in the British Isles during the deepest stretches of prehistory, the periods that conventional history textbooks tend to gloss over in a few paragraphs, before jumping ahead to the comparatively well-documented arrival of the Romans. Britain's prehistoric landscape was shaped by an extraordinary sequence of climatic and geological events. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, much of what is now Britain lay beneath enormous ice sheets, with human habitation pushed back to refuge areas in continental Europe where survivable conditions persisted. As the ice retreated, beginning roughly 15,000 years ago, and continuing in fits and starts over the following millennia, human populations gradually moved back into the landscape, following game herds and exploiting the changing environment as forests, grasslands, and eventually the complex mosaic landscape of post-glacial Britain established itself. Crucially, for much of this period, Britain was not yet an island. The land that would eventually become the English Channel and the southern North Sea was, until roughly 8,000 years ago, a vast expanse of low-lying terrain that archaeologists now call Doggerland, a landscape of rivers, marshes, forests, and coastal plains that connected what is now Britain directly to the European mainland. This means that human populations moved freely across this landscape for thousands of years before rising sea levels, driven by the continued melting of the great ice sheets, gradually submerged Doggerland beneath the waters of the North Sea, severing the land connection and creating the island geography we recognize today. This geological history matters enormously for our purposes, because it means that any structure built during this earlier period, before the final flooding of Doggerland and the establishment of Britain's modern coastline, would have been constructed by populations whose cultural connections, technological capabilities, and historical relationships to the rest of prehistoric Europe remain only partially understood, despite decades of archaeological research. We know these populations existed. We know, from the relatively sparse archaeological evidence that has survived, that they were capable of sophisticated tool-making, that they engaged in long-distance trade and cultural exchange, and that they developed increasingly complex social and ceremonial practices as the millennia progressed. What we know considerably less about is the full extent of their architectural and engineering capabilities, particularly during the earliest phases of this long prehistoric sequence. The monuments that survive and that form the basis of most popular understanding of British prehistory, structures like Stonehenge, Avebury, and the numerous other stone circles and megalithic monuments scattered across the British landscape, represent only the latest and most durable phase of a much longer and more complex sequence of monument building that stretches back considerably further than these famous and relatively well-studied examples. Stonehenge itself, to take the most famous example, was constructed in multiple phases, spanning roughly 1,500 years, beginning around 5,000 years ago with the initial earthwork enclosure, and continuing through successive phases of stone erection and rearrangement over the following centuries. But Stonehenge did not emerge from nothing. The landscape surrounding it shows evidence of human ceremonial and monumental activity stretching back considerably earlier, including structures and features whose full purpose and significance archaeologists continue to debate and investigate even today, using increasingly sophisticated techniques including ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery analysis, and detailed soil chemistry studies that have revealed previously unknown features buried beneath the modern landscape. features that were completely invisible to traditional excavation methods and remained entirely unknown until these modern technologies made their detection possible. This last point deserves particular emphasis because it directly bears on the plausibility of the Section 11 discovery. If modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal previously unknown prehistoric structures buried beneath the British landscape, structures whose existence was completely unsuspected until very recent technological developments made their detection possible, then it becomes considerably less far-fetched to imagine that a similarly unknown and unsuspected structure might have existed beneath what would become London, a structure that happened to be discovered accidentally during 19th century railway construction, decades before any systematic archaeological survey of the area was conducted, and centuries before the kind of remote sensing technology that might have detected such a structure without the need for direct excavation even existed. The question then becomes one of construction technique and apparent sophistication. The megalithic monuments we know from British prehistory, while impressive in scale and clearly representing significant organized labor and engineering knowledge, do not generally exhibit the kind of precise, tightly fitted stone dressing that both Samuel and Halloway describe in their accounts of the Section 11 structure. Stonehenge's massive sarsen stones, while shaped and in some cases fitted with mortise and tenon joints at their tops to secure the horizontal lintels, do not display the kind of precise, mortar-minimal fitting between adjacent stones that characterizes the most famous examples of precision masonry found elsewhere in the ancient world, the kind of construction that immediately drew Samuel's comparison to something more sophisticated than typical English building traditions. This raises an uncomfortable but unavoidable question. If the Section 11 structure was not built using techniques consistent with known British prehistoric monument building, and was not built using techniques consistent with Roman construction, what other possibilities remain? It's at this point in our investigation that we need to consider some of the more speculative and admittedly more controversial theories that have circulated among researchers who have studied this case over the decades, theories that range from relatively conservative reassessments of how sophisticated British prehistoric engineering might have actually been, to considerably more radical proposals involving contact with, or influence from, civilizations and cultures whose presence in ancient Britain, truth about not currently recognized by mainstream archaeological consensus. One line of speculation, favored by researchers who approach this case from a relatively conservative revisionist perspective, suggests that the Section 11 structure might represent evidence of a previously unknown phase of sophisticated megalithic construction in Britain, perhaps representing a specialized ceremonial or astronomical structure built by a particularly skilled group of builders whose techniques, for whatever reason, were not widely replicated or did not survive in the broader archaeological record in the same way that more common monument types like stone circles and burial mounds did. Under this interpretation, the precise stone fitting described in our sources might represent the work of a particularly skilled specialist tradition, perhaps connected to elite or priestly classes within prehistoric British society, whose more sophisticated engineering knowledge was deliberately restricted and therefore left a much sparser archaeological footprint than more widely practiced construction techniques. This interpretation, while still requiring us to accept a level of prehistoric British engineering sophistication beyond what is currently documented in the conventional archaeological record, at least keeps the discovery within the broad framework of known human history and known human migration patterns into the British Isles. A considerably more controversial line of speculation, one that researchers approach with substantially more caution given the lack of any solid corroborating evidence, ventures into territory involving claims of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, ancient maritime networks connecting Britain to civilizations in other parts of the world during periods when conventional archaeology assumes no such contact existed, and in the most extreme versions of this speculation, connections to the broader body of claims regarding lost or forgotten advanced civilizations whose existence predates and potentially influenced the development of recognized ancient cultures across multiple continents. We will examine these more speculative theories in greater detail later in our investigation because they cannot simply be dismissed without consideration, particularly given certain additional pieces of evidence that emerge when we examine other discoveries from this same general period and region that share curious similarities with what was found at Section 11. But first, we need to return to the night of the reburial itself, and to a piece of testimony that, while difficult to verify with complete confidence, adds a genuinely unsettling dimension to our understanding of what those navvies actually witnessed in 1842 and why the order to conceal it again was apparently treated with such extraordinary urgency. The piece of testimony we need to address now comes from a source considerably more obscure than either Samuel's family account or Halloway's preserved correspondence, and it requires us to acknowledge up front that its reliability is genuinely difficult to assess, sitting at the very edge of what responsible historical investigation can comfortably accept as credible evidence rather than embellished folklore that accumulated around an already mysterious story over the subsequent decades. This account comes from a privately printed memoir, produced in extremely limited quantity in the final years of the 19th century, written by a man who identified himself only by the initials J.T., and who claimed, within the memoir's brief and somewhat rambling text, to have worked as a young labourer on railway construction projects throughout the London area during the 1840s, including, he states explicitly, a period working under contract for the same company responsible for the Section 11 excavation. The memoir itself was apparently produced for private circulation among family members, and only a small number of copies are known to survive in archival collections, having been donated by descendants who recognize some potential historical value in the document, without necessarily understanding the full significance of the specific passage we're about to discuss. J.T.'s account of the reburial differs in several important respects from Samuel's second-hand version, and these differences are worth noting precisely because they suggest, if both accounts contain genuine kernels of truth, that we might be dealing with testimony from two different individuals who witnessed or heard about the reburial process from somewhat different vantage points or through different channels of information, rather than a single unified narrative that has simply been distorted through retelling. According to J.T.'s account, he was not himself present at the Section 11 site during the reburial, having been working on a different section of the line at the time, but he claims to have spoken, within a relatively short time after the events in question, with a man who had been part of the reburial crew, a conversation that apparently took place in a public house frequented by railway labourers, the kind of informal social setting where, despite explicit instructions to maintain silence, alcohol and camaraderie, not infrequently loosened tongues regarding matters that were officially supposed to remain confidential. The detail that J.T. records, and which has never appeared in any other surviving source related to this case, concerns what this unnamed worker apparently described as unusual physical sensations experienced by the reburial crew while working at the site, sensations that the worker attributed, in J.T.'s recollection, to some quality of the air or atmosphere within the partially reopened excavation. J.T. describes the worker as mentioning headaches, a sense of pressure or unease that several of the crew reportedly experienced, and in one particularly striking detail, a claim that at least one member of the crew reported hearing what he described as a low humming or droning sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere within or around the structure itself, a sound that several other crew members apparently could not perceive at all, or perceived only faintly, leading to some friction and disagreement among the men about whether this individual was imagining things or genuinely experiencing something the others simply couldn't detect. We need to treat this particular detail with considerable caution. Claims of unusual sounds, physical sensations, or other quasi-paranormal phenomena associated with ancient or mysterious sites are extremely common throughout folklore and amateur historical investigation, and such claims are notoriously difficult to verify or take at face value, particularly when they appear in a single source, removed by at least two layers of retelling from the original alleged experience, and recorded in a memoir written decades after the events it describes, by which point the natural human tendency toward embellishment and dramatic enhancement of a good story would have had ample time to operate, whether consciously or unconsciously, on whatever kernel of genuine experience might have originally existed. That said, It would be intellectually dishonest to simply omit this detail from our investigation, particularly because it does align, in a general sense, with a broader pattern of similar reports associated with certain other ancient sites around the world, sites where visitors and researchers have reported comparable sensations, sounds, or unexplained phenomena, reports that remain, it should be emphasized, entirely outside the bounds of what mainstream science currently considers verified or explicable phenomena, but which nonetheless appear with sufficient frequency and consistency across geographically and culturally unrelated locations that some researchers have argued they deserve more serious investigation than they typically receive, rather than simply being dismissed as superstition or coincidence. Whether the Section 11 structure was associated with any genuine, unusual physical phenomena, or whether JT's account simply represents an embellished retelling of an already mysterious story, accumulating additional dramatic flourishes as it passed through informal oral transmission before finally being committed to writing decades later, is impossible to determine with any confidence based on the surviving evidence. We present this detail not as confirmed fact, but as part of the complete picture of testimony surrounding this case, allowing you to weigh its credibility for yourself, as you would with any piece of historical evidence that sits at the boundary between documented fact and persistent folklore, the kind of testimony that historians are trained to neither dismiss outright nor accept uncritically, but to hold carefully, provisionally, in the space between the two. What JT's account does add, beyond this more speculative element, is additional corroborating detail regarding the markings on the stone that both Samuel and Halloway separately describe. According to JT's recollection of his conversation with the reburial crew member, the more thorough excavation conducted before the final reburial revealed that these markings extended across a considerably larger area of the structure than had been visible during the original discovery, and that they appeared, to at least some of the men who observed them more closely, to follow a repeating pattern, suggesting some kind of systematic, rather than purely decorative arrangement, the kind of repetition one might expect from a written script or formalized symbolic system, rather than purely artistic or random ornamentation. If accurate, this detail considerably strengthens the possibility that the Section 11 structure bore some form of writing or proto-writing, a possibility that, if true, would represent an extraordinarily significant archaeological finding regardless of which civilization or culture ultimately proves responsible for its construction. Since the development of writing systems represents one of the most significant and well-studied milestones in any society's cultural and technological development, and evidence of writing associated with a structure that doesn't match any currently recognized ancient culture active in Britain would represent a genuinely unprecedented archaeological puzzle. This raises an obvious and pressing question. If these markings did indeed represent some form of writing or systematic symbolic notation, was there any attempt made, either by the gentleman who supervised the final examination of the structure before its reburial, or by Halloway himself in his earlier, more limited examination, to record or copy these markings in sufficient detail that they might be analyzed and potentially deciphered, either at the time or by future researchers who might develop the necessary expertise and comparative knowledge to make sense of them? We've already discussed Halloway's frustratingly brief and now lost sketch attempt, but there is one additional and considerably more tantalizing piece of evidence regarding this question, a piece of evidence that brings us, finally, to perhaps the most genuinely remarkable and difficult to fully verify claim in this entire case: the possibility that a more complete record of these markings did, in fact, survive, hidden away not in any public archive or institutional collection, but within the private papers of one of the very gentlemen who supervised the structure's final examination and reburial, papers that remained essentially unknown to researchers until a chance discovery decades later began to reveal just how much more there might be to learn about what was really buried beneath that London railway cutting in 1842. The story of how this additional evidence came to light involves a journey that takes us nearly a full century forward from the original 1842 discovery into the middle decades of the 20th century and into circumstances that, while less dramatic than the original railway excavation itself, nonetheless represent a genuinely important development in our understanding of this case, precisely because they involve documentation produced by someone who appears to have had direct, first-hand access to a more complete examination of the structure than either Samuel or Halloway were able to provide. In the early 1930s, a regional auction house specializing in estate sales and the disposal of family archives following the death of elderly property owners handled the contents of a substantial country house that had remained in the same family for several generations before finally being sold off as the last. Surviving family members either died or moved into considerably reduced circumstances, a common pattern across Britain during this period, as the economic pressures of the early 20th century, combined with the devastating impact of the First World War on an entire generation of young men from landed families, led to the gradual dissolution of many estates that had remained intact for centuries. Among the contents of this house was a substantial collection of personal papers, correspondence, and miscellaneous documents accumulated over multiple generations, the kind of family archive that, in many cases, ends up either destroyed during house clearances by people who don't recognize or value its historical significance, or, in more fortunate cases, purchased in bulk by dealers and eventually finding its way into either private collections or, occasionally, institutional archives where researchers might eventually have the opportunity to examine it properly. In this particular instance, the papers were purchased, apparently as a single undifferentiated lot, by a private collector with an interest in Victorian social and economic history. A collector who, by all accounts, had no specific interest in or knowledge of the Section 11 discovery and was simply interested in the broader historical value of a substantial 19th century family archive. This collection remained in private hands, largely unexamined in detail beyond a basic inventory, for several more decades, before eventually being donated to a regional archive following the collector's own death in the 1970s, at which point archivists began the slow process of cataloguing and assessing the collection's contents in proper detail. It was during this cataloguing process, conducted by an archivist with a personal interest in railway history, who had previously encountered references to the Section 11 discovery through other research, that a connection was finally made between this newly catalogued family archive and the mysterious 1842 incident. The family in question, it turned out, had direct and substantial ties to the railway company involved in the original discovery, with one family member having served on the company's board of directors during precisely the relevant period, a connection that immediately raised the possibility that the family papers might contain material directly relevant to understanding how the discovery was handled at the highest levels of the company's decision-making structure. This possibility proved to be correct, and considerably more significant than even the archivist's initial hopeful speculation might have suggested. Among the papers was a private notebook, clearly distinguished from the family's more routine business and personal correspondence by its physical format and by the evident care with which it had been preserved separately from other documents, suggesting that even within the family's own archival practices, this particular item was treated as something requiring special handling and protection. The notebook belonged to the board member in question, a man whose name we will refer to here simply as Director R, since researchers studying this case have generally chosen to exercise some discretion regarding the full identification of his descendants, who, while having no direct involvement in or responsibility for events that occurred nearly a century before most of them were even born, have understandably expressed some discomfort with the public attention this case has periodically attracted, as more details have gradually come to light through subsequent research, and more recently, online discussion and speculation. Director R's notebook contains entries spanning several years of his involvement with the railway company, covering routine business matters, financial considerations, and various administrative concerns typical of a Victorian company director's responsibilities. But interspersed among these routine entries, beginning in the autumn of 1842 and continuing intermittently for several months thereafter, are a series of considerably more detailed and evidently more personally significant entries directly addressing the Section 11 discovery, entries that provide, for the first time in the surviving historical record, a perspective from someone who appears to have been directly involved in the highest level decision-making regarding how the discovery should be handled, rather than simply a worker or junior engineer reporting on events from a more limited vantage point. Director R's entries confirm much of what we've already pieced together from Samuel's and Halloway's accounts, but they also add several crucial new details that significantly expand our understanding of what was actually found and why it was considered so important to conceal. Most significantly, Director R's notebook contains what appears to be a careful and considerably more skilled, hand-drawn sketch of a portion of the markings found on the structure. A sketch that, unlike Halloway's apparently lost attempt, has survived intact and is now preserved within the regional archive that holds the broader family collection. This sketch, when first properly examined by researchers in the 1980s, following the broader cataloguing of the family archive, generated immediate and considerable excitement, precisely because it appeared to show a repeating geometric pattern that bore certain superficial similarities to symbolic systems documented at various ancient sites elsewhere in the world, though it's important to note that the similarities are, at best, suggestive rather than definitively conclusive, and any direct comparison between this sketch and other ancient symbolic systems requires considerable caution given the limitations of working from a single hand-drawn copy rather than the original stone surface itself. The pattern, as recorded in Director R's sketch, consists of a series of nested geometric elements, combining what appear to be straight-line segments arranged at consistent angles with occasional curved or circular elements integrated into the overall design. The pattern repeats with apparent regularity across the portion of the structure that was examined, suggesting, as J.T.'s second-hand account had indicated, a systematic rather than purely decorative arrangement. Whether this pattern represents an actual writing system, a more abstract symbolic or religious notation, or some kind of structural or functional marking related to the construction process itself, perhaps indicating how individual stone blocks were meant to be aligned or positioned during the original building process, remains entirely unresolved, and researchers who have examined the sketch have offered considerably divergent interpretations without reaching any consensus. Director R's accompanying written notes, which we will examine in considerably more detail in our next section, provide additional crucial context regarding why this discovery was treated with such urgency and why the decision was ultimately made to conceal it once again rather than pursue further investigation or public disclosure. These notes reveal a decision-making process considerably more complex and considerably more institutionally coordinated than the surviving evidence from Halloway's perspective alone had previously suggested, involving not just the railway company's own leadership, but, as we will see, connections extending into some of the most prestigious and influential scientific and religious institutions of Victorian Britain. Director R's notebook entries, once properly transcribed and analysed by researchers in the years following their rediscovery, reveal a decision-making process that unfolded over a period of roughly 3 weeks following the initial discovery, involving consultation with multiple parties whose identities Director R records with considerably more specificity than either Samuel's or Halloway's accounts provide, though still using a combination of initials, titles, and occasionally deliberately vague descriptions that suggest even in his own private notebook, intended presumably for his eyes alone, Director R exercised a degree of caution about explicitly naming everyone involved in this affair. The first substantive entry, dated within a week of the original discovery, records that Director R was personally informed of the find by Ashworth, the resident engineer who had originally received Halloway's report. Director R's notes indicate that his initial reaction was one of considerable interest rather than alarm, and he records having immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery from a purely antiquarian and scientific perspective, suggesting that his subsequent involvement in the effort to suppress wider knowledge of the find was driven by external pressure and consultation with other parties, rather than any personal instinct toward concealment. This detail is significant because it humanizes Director R in a way that the more distant and institutional framing of earlier accounts had not fully captured. He was not, based on his own private notes, a man inherently inclined towards suppressing scientific discovery. Rather, he appears to have been persuaded, over the course of the following weeks that concealment was the only viable course of action available to him, a conclusion he reached reluctantly, and with what his later entries suggest was genuine and lasting personal regret. The second key entry, dated approximately 10 days after the discovery, describes a meeting Director R attended along with two other railway company board members and, significantly, a representative from what he describes only as the Learned Society, a phrase that researchers have generally interpreted as a reference to one of the established scientific or antiquarian societies of the period, though which specific organization remains a matter of some debate, with the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Geological Society of London, all representing plausible candidates given their respective areas of interest and their well-documented institutional concerns during this period regarding discoveries that might complicate established scientific and religious consensus. Director R's account of this meeting is considerably more detailed than anything previously available in the historical record, and it provides our clearest window yet into the actual arguments and considerations that drove the eventual decision to conceal the discovery. According to his notes, the representative from the Learned Society argued forcefully that premature public disclosure of the find, before its true nature and origin could be properly established through careful scholarly investigation, risked generating exactly the kind of sensationalized and uncontrolled public speculation that the more established and conservative elements of the Victorian scientific establishment were already struggling to manage in relation to other, contentious discoveries from this same period, discoveries related to human antiquity, geological deep time, and the mounting body of evidence that challenged traditional biblical chronology. This argument, as recorded by Director R, framed the proposed concealment not as a permanent suppression of the truth, but as a temporary measure intended to allow for proper, careful, scholarly investigation to proceed without the distorting pressure of public attention and speculation. An investigation that, the representative apparently argued, could be conducted more effectively and more rigorously if access to the site and to information about the discovery was carefully controlled and limited to a small number of qualified researchers, rather than thrown open to the kind of uncontrolled public and journalistic interest that a major discovery of this nature would inevitably attract if news of it spread freely. Whether this argument represented a genuine and good faith position, or whether it functioned primarily as a convenient justification for what was, in practice, a far more permanent and far less scientifically motivated act of concealment, is a question that Director R's own later entries suggest he himself came to wrestle with considerably, as the promised careful scholarly investigation apparently never actually materialized in any meaningful form, with the structure instead being reburied within a matter of days following this meeting, with no subsequent attempt, as far as the surviving record indicates, to conduct any further examination or to pursue the kind of rigorous scholarly study that had supposedly justified the initial decision to limit public knowledge of the find. A third entry, dated shortly after the structure's final reburial, captures Director R's evident discomfort with how events had actually unfolded compared to what he had initially understood to be the agreed-upon plan. He writes, and this passage has been quoted extensively by researchers studying this case, precisely because of its unusually candid and reflective tone for a Victorian businessman's private notebook, that he had understood the concealment to be temporary, pending further study, but that he now found himself uncertain whether any such study would ever actually take place, and whether he had been, in his own words, made complicit in an act of concealment considerably more final than I was led to believe. This admission is genuinely significant, because it suggests that even among the relatively small circle of people who orchestrated the suppression of this discovery, there existed considerable internal disagreement and discomfort about what was actually being done and why. Director R does not appear to have been a willing or enthusiastic participant in a deliberate, premeditated cover-up motivated by malicious intent to deceive the public. Rather, he appears to have been persuaded, through arguments that at least superficially appealed to legitimate scientific caution and methodological rigor, to support a course of action that he subsequently came to recognize had been used to achieve a considerably more permanent and less scientifically justified outcome than he had originally understood and agreed to. This pattern, incidentally, is consistent with how many historical instances of institutional suppression and concealment actually function in practice, a detail worth emphasizing because popular conceptions of historical cover-ups often imagine a unified group of conspirators acting with full knowledge and shared malicious intent toward concealing the truth. The reality, as Director R's notebook entries suggest, is frequently considerably messier and more morally ambiguous, involving individuals who are persuaded, often through arguments that contain genuine elements of legitimate concern, to support actions whose ultimate consequences and true motivations they may not fully understand or agree with, and who subsequently find themselves uncomfortable participants in outcomes considerably more troubling than what they originally believed they were sanctioning. Director R's final substantive entry on this subject, dated several months after the original discovery, records his decision to preserve his notes and the accompanying sketch within his private papers, explicitly stating his intention that they should remain within the family rather than being destroyed, a decision he frames as a kind of personal insurance against what he describes as his own uncertainty about whether the right course of action had ultimately been taken. He writes that he hopes future generations, presumably meaning his own descendants rather than the broader public, might one day have access to information that he himself felt unable to act upon more decisively given the social, professional, and institutional pressures he found himself navigating. This decision, whatever its precise motivations, proved enormously consequential for our ability, nearly 2 centuries later, to understand what actually happened at Section 11, because without Director R's preserved notebook and sketch, our understanding of this case would remain limited to the considerably more fragmentary and less detailed accounts provided by Samuel, Halloway, and the more questionable second-hand testimony preserved in J.T.'s memoir. With Director R's evidence added to the picture, we have a considerably more complete, though still far from definitive, understanding of both what was found and why the decision was made to conceal it once again. But Director R's notebook, valuable as it is, still doesn't answer the most fundamental question at the heart of this entire case. What, precisely, was this structure, and who actually built it? To pursue this question further, we need to examine what happened to this case in the decades and eventually centuries following the original discovery, including several subsequent attempts, some more credible than others, to locate and re-examine the site, using the kind of modern investigative techniques that simply didn't exist in 1842. The first documented attempt to revisit the question of what lay beneath Section 11 came not from professional archaeologists or historians, but from an amateur antiquarian society operating in the early 20th century, a group of enthusiasts whose collective interest in London's hidden and forgotten history led them to compile and cross-reference whatever fragmentary references to unusual underground discoveries they could locate within local newspapers, parish records, and the kind of informal oral tradition that persisted among long-established London families whose ancestors had lived and worked in the relevant areas for generations. This society, whose own surviving records are themselves somewhat fragmentary and incomplete, apparently became aware of the Section 11 story sometime in the early 1900s, likely through descendants of either Samuel or one of the other original Discovery crew members, since by this point, the original participants in the 1842 events had largely passed away, but their children and grandchildren, having grown up hearing fragments of the story, even if sworn to broader discretion, occasionally proved willing to share what they knew with sympathetic researchers who approached the topic with genuine scholarly interest rather than sensationalized curiosity. The Society's investigation, hampered by the limited resources and methodological sophistication available to amateur historians of this period, focused primarily on attempting to establish the precise location of the original Section 11 cutting, using whatever surviving railway company maps and engineering records they could access through personal connections and informal archival research. Since formal public access to historical company records was considerably more restricted during this period than it would later become, this effort met with partial success. The Society's surviving correspondence, indicates that they were able to establish a reasonably confident identification of the general area where the original discovery occurred, an area that, by the time of their early 20th century investigation, had already been built over multiple times, as London's relentless urban expansion continued to transform the landscape, with the original railway cutting itself having long since been incorporated into a much more extensive network of rail infrastructure, with additional tracks, platforms, and supporting structures built directly on top of and around the original 1842 excavation. This building over of the site represents one of the most significant practical obstacles to any modern attempt to verify the Section 11 story through direct physical investigation. Unlike many archaeological mysteries, where the relevant site remains relatively undisturbed and accessible, even if its true significance was previously unrecognized, the location of the original discovery has been continuously built upon, modified, and developed for nearly 2 centuries since the events in question, making any direct excavation or investigation enormously more complex, expensive, and practically difficult than would be the case for a site that had simply remained undeveloped farmland or open ground in the intervening years. The amateur society's interest in the case, despite this practical obstacle, apparently led them to attempt a more direct approach, sometime around 1910, requesting formal access to relevant railway company archives in hopes of locating original engineering documents and correspondence that might provide additional confirmation of the story they had pieced together from family testimony and limited documentary research. This request, according to the Society's surviving correspondence, was met with what they describe as unexpected and somewhat puzzling resistance from the railway company, which had by this point undergone several mergers and corporate restructurings since 1842, complicating the question of which specific corporate entity actually held custody of the relevant historical records. The Society's secretary, in a letter preserved within their surviving archive, expresses considerable frustration with what he describes as evasive and unhelpful responses from company representatives who apparently claimed, somewhat implausibly given the company's generally meticulous record-keeping practices for this period, that relevant records from the early 1840s covering this specific section of line had been lost, destroyed, or were otherwise unavailable for examination by outside researchers. Whether this represented genuine record loss, which would not be entirely implausible given the chaotic history of corporate mergers, relocations, and occasional fires that affected many Victorian business archives over subsequent decades, or whether it represented a more deliberate continuation of the original effort to limit knowledge of the Section 11 discovery, is impossible to determine with confidence based on the surviving evidence. The Amateur Society's investigation appears to have stalled at this point, with no further substantive progress documented in their surviving records, and the organization itself appears to have dissolved sometime in the 1920s, its remaining papers and research materials eventually being dispersed among various private collections, and in some cases, ending up in regional archives where they would only be properly catalogued and made accessible to later researchers many decades afterward, following exactly the kind of gradual institutional archiving process that eventually brought Director R's notebook to light as well. The next significant phase of investigation into this case occurred considerably later, in the 1970s and 1980s, coinciding with both the broader cataloguing of Director R's family archive that we've already discussed, and with a more general resurgence of popular interest in alternative and revisionist historical theories that characterized this particular period, a cultural moment when books and television programs exploring supposedly suppressed or forgotten ancient history achieved considerable mainstream popularity and commercial success, creating, for better or worse, a more receptive audience for stories like the Section 11 discovery, while simultaneously making it considerably more difficult to separate genuine historical investigation from the kind of sensationalized speculation and outright fabrication that proliferated within this broader cultural environment. It was during this period that researchers studying this case first attempted to apply more rigorous modern historical methodology to evaluating the surviving evidence, cross-referencing Samuel's family account, Halloway's correspondence, JT's memoir, and the newly discovered Director R notebook against each other and against whatever surviving railway company and geological records could be located, in an effort to establish which elements of the story could be considered reasonably well corroborated across multiple independent sources, and which elements remained more speculative or single-sourced and therefore deserving of greater skepticism. This more rigorous cross-referencing exercise, while not resolving the central mystery of what the structure actually was or who built it, did succeed in establishing a reasonably confident core narrative that researchers studying this case have generally come to accept as representing the most historically defensible version of events, that a substantial stone structure of unknown origin and unusual construction technique was indeed discovered at significant depth during railway excavation in 1842, that this discovery generated genuine alarm and concern among the engineers and company officials involved, that a deliberate and coordinated effort was made to conceal the discovery and ensure the silence of everyone involved, and that this effort involved consultation with and apparent approval from at least one established scientific or antiquarian institution of the period, whose representatives argued for concealment on grounds of preventing premature and uncontrolled public speculation, an argument that may have been at least partially sincere, but which ultimately resulted in a far more permanent suppression of the discovery than appears to have been originally intended, or sanctioned even by some of the very people who initially supported the concealment effort. What remains considerably less certain, and what continues to generate the most active speculation and debate among researchers and enthusiasts who have encountered this story in subsequent decades, is the question we've been circling throughout this entire investigation. What was this structure? Who built it, and when? Having established as solid a factual foundation as the surviving evidence allows, we can now turn our attention more directly to this central question, examining the various theories that have been proposed and weighing them against both the specific details preserved in our primary sources and the broader archaeological and historical context within which any credible explanation must ultimately fit. Let's examine each of the major theories that researchers have proposed to explain the Section 11 structure, weighing the evidence for and against each, and being as honest as possible about the limitations of our ability to reach any truly definitive conclusion, given the absence of physical samples and the impossibility, at least for the foreseeable future, of conducting a modern archaeological excavation at the actual site, buried as it now is beneath nearly 2 centuries of subsequent urban development. The first and most conservative theory holds that the structure represented an unusually sophisticated example of Romano-British construction, perhaps an underground chamber or cistern associated with a villa or other significant Roman settlement that has otherwise left no surface trace, its existence and location having been entirely forgotten by the time London's later urban development obscured the relevant area. This theory has the advantage of requiring no departure from established historical understanding of Roman Britain, and it's worth noting that Roman London, known to the Romans as Londinium, was indeed a substantial and sophisticated settlement, with archaeological work conducted both before and after the Section 11 discovery, confirming the existence of an extensive network of Roman buildings, roads, and infrastructure beneath the modern city, considerably more extensive than was understood even by the relatively well-informed antiquarians of the 1840s. However, this theory struggles to account for several specific details preserved in our sources. The depth of 40 feet is considerably greater than typical Roman remains found elsewhere in London, which generally occur at depths of perhaps 15 to 25 feet below modern street level, reflecting the roughly 18 centuries of accumulated sediment, debris, and deliberate ground raising that has occurred since the Roman period, as London's urban landscape has been repeatedly rebuilt and modified. A depth of 40 feet would suggest either an unusually deep Roman structure, perhaps a well or specialized underground chamber built to unusual depth for some specific functional reason, or alternatively, a structure considerably older than the Roman period that happened to be located in an area where additional natural sediment deposition occurred over subsequent millennia, pushing it to a greater depth than would be typical for genuinely Roman-era construction. The construction technique, described in our sources, with its precise fitting and minimal mortar use, also sits somewhat awkwardly with typical Roman building practices in Britain, which generally employed mortar more extensively as a structural binding agent, reflecting techniques the Romans had developed and refined across their extensive empire, techniques well documented through numerous surviving examples of genuine Roman construction, both in London and across Britain more broadly. While Roman engineers were certainly capable of precise stone cutting and fitting when circumstances required it, the specific combination of features described in our sources, the unusual depth, the curved rather than rectilinear structure, the unfamiliar stone type, and the apparently systematic symbolic markings, taken together, present a somewhat unusual profile that doesn't perfectly match the most common and well-documented patterns of Roman construction found elsewhere in the city. The second major theory, which we touched upon earlier, proposes that the structure represents evidence of a previously unrecognized phase of sophisticated prehistoric British construction, predating not just the Romans, but potentially predating even the well-known megalithic monument building tradition associated with sites like Stonehenge and Avebury. This theory has gained increasing credibility in recent decades as ongoing archaeological research, employing increasingly sophisticated remote sensing and excavation techniques, has continued to reveal that prehistoric British society was considerably more complex, more technologically sophisticated, and more extensively organized than earlier generations of archaeologists generally assumed. Discoveries made well into the 21st century, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques, have revealed previously unknown monumental structures within the broader landscape surrounding well-known sites like Stonehenge, structures whose existence was completely unsuspected, until these modern technologies made their detection possible without the need for invasive excavation. This ongoing pattern of discovery strongly suggests that our current understanding of prehistoric British monument building remains significantly incomplete, and that additional unknown structures, potentially including structures considerably more sophisticated in their construction technique than the relatively well-documented examples we currently recognize, likely remain undiscovered beneath the British landscape, whether in rural areas that have never been subject to systematic archaeological survey, or, as the Section 11 case suggests, beneath the heavily developed urban landscape of London itself, where any prehistoric structures that might once have existed would be almost entirely inaccessible to conventional archaeological investigation, given the extensive and continuous urban development that has occurred over the subsequent centuries. If the Section 11 structure does indeed represent evidence of this kind of previously unrecognized prehistoric sophistication, it would suggest the existence of construction techniques and possibly symbolic or written communication systems considerably more advanced than current archaeological consensus generally attributes to prehistoric British society, a possibility that, while certainly more conservative than some of the more speculative theories we'll discuss shortly, would nonetheless represent a genuinely significant revision to our understanding of British prehistory, requiring archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about the technological and organizational capabilities of the various prehistoric cultures known to have inhabited the British Isles across the many thousands of years before the arrival of the Romans. The third theory, considerably more speculative and considerably more contentious among researchers who have studied this case, ventures into territory involving claims of ancient transoceanic contact and the broader, often controversial body of theory, sometimes referred to as diffusionism, the idea that significant technological and cultural developments in one part of the ancient world spread to other regions through direct contact and migration, rather than developing independently through parallel but unconnected processes of cultural and technological evolution, which represents the more mainstream archaeological consensus regarding how similar technologies and practices sometimes emerged in geographically separated ancient cultures, without requiring any direct contact between them. Proponents of more speculative diffusionist theories applied to the Section 11 case point to the description of precise, minimal mortar stone fitting as potentially consistent with construction techniques documented at certain ancient sites in other parts of the world, sites whose builders developed remarkably sophisticated stone working techniques that, in some cases, continue to generate genuine scholarly debate and investigation regarding exactly how such precision was achieved using the tools and technologies available to the relevant ancient cultures. The suggestion, in its most developed form, is that the Section 11 structure might represent evidence of contact between ancient British populations and a more distant culture whose construction techniques and possibly symbolic writing system somehow influenced or were directly transplanted into Britain through means that conventional archaeology does not currently recognize or accept as having occurred. It's important to be direct and honest about the significant evidentiary challenges facing this third category of theory. Mainstream archaeological consensus, based on an enormous accumulated body of evidence regarding ancient trade networks, technological development, and population movements, generally does not support the kind of long-distance transoceanic contact that the more developed versions of this theory require, at least not during the specific time periods that would be relevant to a structure found at the depth and in the geological context described for Section 11. This doesn't mean such theories are necessarily impossible, since our understanding of ancient maritime capabilities and trade networks has indeed expanded considerably as new archaeological evidence has accumulated over recent decades, revealing ancient seafaring and trading capabilities considerably more extensive than earlier generations of archaeologists assumed. But it does mean that any theory requiring this kind of contact needs to meet a correspondingly high evidentiary bar before it can be considered a credible explanation, rather than speculative theorizing that extends well beyond what the feature available evidence can actually support. Given the absence of any physical sample from the Section 11 structure that could be subjected to modern dating, geological sourcing, or comparative analysis against known construction techniques from other ancient cultures, we are, frankly, not in a position to definitively favor any of these three theories over the others, based purely on the surviving documentary evidence. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that something genuinely unusual was found, that it generated genuine concern and alarm among credible, professionally trained observers who had relevant comparative experience with known Roman remains, and that a deliberate and coordinated institutional effort was made to ensure the discovery was concealed rather than properly investigated. An effort that succeeded so thoroughly that nearly 2 centuries later, we remain unable to provide a definitive answer to the most basic question this case raises. What, exactly, was buried 40 feet beneath the London clay, and why was the decision made that the world was better off not knowing? Before we move toward the closing reflections of tonight's story, it's worth taking a moment to place the Section 11 case within an even broader pattern that researchers interested in the history of archaeological discovery and institutional suppression have identified across multiple similar cases scattered throughout Britain and, indeed, throughout the wider world during this same general historical period. Understanding this broader pattern doesn't resolve the specific mystery of what was found beneath London in 1842, but it does help us understand why such suppression, when it occurred, tended to follow remarkably similar patterns regardless of the specific location or culture involved, suggesting that we're looking at a genuinely systemic phenomenon rather than an isolated and unusual incident unique to this single case. Throughout the 19th century, as railway construction, urban expansion, and increasingly ambitious civil engineering projects pushed excavation to greater depths and across greater areas than had ever previously been practical, similar reports of unusual and unexplained discoveries surface with some regularity in the historical record, though most exist only as brief mentions in local newspapers, passing references in private correspondence, or fragments of oral tradition that, much like the Section 11 story, were preserved primarily through family memory rather than formal institutional documentation, precisely because the institutions involved generally had strong incentives to minimize or avoid documenting discoveries that complicated their preferred historical and religious narratives. These reports span an enormous range of described phenomena, from relatively mundane and easily explicable discoveries of forgotten medieval structures and earlier Roman remains that were simply misidentified or exaggerated through the natural process of storytelling and retelling, to considerably more puzzling cases that, like Section 11, involve descriptions of construction techniques, materials, or symbolic markings that don't comfortably fit within established historical frameworks for the relevant region and time period. What's particularly notable, and what lends a degree of broader credibility to the Section 11 case specifically, is the consistency with which these various reports describe similar patterns of institutional response when significant or unusual discoveries occurred. The pattern generally involves an initial period of genuine scientific or antiquarian interest and investigation, followed by a relatively swift and often somewhat mysterious transition toward concealment, minimization, or simple cessation of further investigation, frequently accompanied by some combination of financial inducement and implicit or explicit threat directed toward the original discoverers, designed to ensure their continued silence regarding what they had witnessed. This pattern, repeated across multiple documented cases from this general period, suggests the existence of what we might call an informal, but nonetheless genuinely coordinated institutional response mechanism, a kind of unofficial but well-understood protocol among the relevant scientific, religious, and economic authorities of Victorian Britain for handling discoveries that threaten to complicate the carefully constructed historical and religious narrative that underpinned much of Victorian society's understanding of its own place within human history and within a divinely ordained, cosmic order that placed Britain, and by extension British civilization and the Christian religious tradition more broadly, at the pinnacle of a relatively brief and well-understood historical sequence, stretching back only a few thousand years to a biblically sanctioned moment of creation. A discovery suggesting the existence of sophisticated, technologically advanced civilizations predating this biblically sanctioned timeline, civilizations whose identity and historical relationship to recognized ancient cultures remained entirely unclear, represented a genuinely existential threat to this carefully constructed worldview, not merely an inconvenient scientific curiosity to be quietly noted and set aside for future study, but a direct challenge to the entire framework through which an entire society understood its own place in time. It's within this broader context of genuine ideological and institutional anxiety that we need to understand why a discovery like Section 11 would have prompted such a swift, coordinated, and ultimately remarkably effective effort at suppression, an effort that succeeded in keeping the story almost entirely out of public knowledge for well over a century, and that, even now, with considerably more evidence available than researchers possessed even just a few decades ago, has still not yielded a definitive resolution to the central mystery of what was actually found. This pattern of suppression, it should be emphasized, was not necessarily driven by a single unified conspiracy with clear malicious intent, in the way that popular conceptions of historical cover-ups often imagine. Rather, as Director R's own notebook entries suggest, it appears to have emerged from a more diffuse and complex combination of genuine scientific caution, institutional self-interest, religious and ideological anxiety, and the simple practical reality that powerful Victorian institutions, whether scientific, religious, or commercial, possessed both the means and the strong motivation to manage and control information that threatened their respective interests and worldviews, even when individual participants in this process, like Director R himself, harbored genuine personal doubts and reservations about whether the resulting concealment truly served the broader public interest. This broader pattern also helps explain why, despite the passage of nearly 2 centuries and the considerable advances in both historical research methodology and public access to archival materials that have occurred over this period, cases like Section 11 remain so difficult to fully resolve. The very effectiveness of the original suppression effort, combined with the physical destruction or burial of the primary evidence itself, means that researchers today are left working with the same fundamentally incomplete and fragmentary documentary record that has characterized this case from the very beginning, supplemented only by occasional chance discoveries like Director R's notebook, discoveries that, while valuable, have thus far provided additional context and corroboration, without ever providing the kind of definitive physical evidence that could finally and conclusively resolve the central mystery. This raises an important question that we should address directly before moving toward our closing reflections. Is there any realistic possibility that this mystery could still be resolved through future investigation, whether through additional archival research, technological advances in remote sensing that might allow investigation of the relevant area without requiring the kind of disruptive and expensive excavation that would be necessary to physically access the site beneath nearly 2 centuries of subsequent urban development, or through some other avenue of inquiry that current researchers may not have yet fully explored or considered? The honest answer is that meaningful progress remains possible, though significant obstacles persist. Modern ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive geological survey techniques have advanced considerably, even within just the past few decades, and it's not entirely implausible that a properly funded and carefully targeted survey of the relevant area, conducted with appropriate cooperation from current property owners and transport authorities who control the modern infrastructure now situated above the original 1,842 site, could potentially detect anomalies consistent with the presence of a buried structure, even without requiring full excavation. Whether such a survey will ever actually be conducted, given the practical, financial, and bureaucratic obstacles involved in accessing and surveying land beneath active transport infrastructure, remains uncertain. But the technological capability to at least attempt such an investigation now exists in a way that simply wasn't available to researchers even a generation ago. Additionally, the continued process of archival cataloguing and digitization occurring across British, regional, and national archives raises the genuine possibility that additional documentary evidence, similar in nature to Director R's notebook, might still exist within other family or institutional archives that have not yet been fully catalogued or examined in detail, waiting for some future researcher, possibly working decades from now, to make the same kind of fortunate connection that led to the rediscovery of Director R's papers in the 1970s and 1980s. Given how many similar Victorian family archives remain only partially catalogued even today, scattered across regional archives, private collections, and institutional repositories throughout Britain, the possibility that additional relevant evidence remains to be discovered should not be dismissed, even as we acknowledge that any such future discovery remains, by its very nature, impossible to predict or guarantee. Let's return, for a moment, to Samuel, the navvy, whose pick first struck that hollow-sounding stone in the darkness 40 feet beneath the London clay, because his story, more than any of the institutional maneuvering we've spent the last hour examining, represents the genuinely human heart of this entire case, and it deserves to be told with the care and attention that the more dramatic and mysterious elements of the story have sometimes overshadowed in previous tellings. Samuel continued working as a navvy for the better part of 2 more decades, following the events of 1842, moving from project to project as the Great Victorian Railway boom continued to reshape Britain's landscape, eventually transitioning, as many navvies did once their bodies could no longer sustain the brutal physical demands of the work, into less physically demanding employment, in his case a position as a watchman and general labourer at a goods yard, the work that allowed him to remain connected to the railway industry that had defined so much of his working life, while no longer requiring the kind of grueling physical exertion that had characterized his younger years. He married relatively young, according to the genealogical records his descendants have helped piece together, and raised a family of 5 children, 3 of whom survived into adulthood, a survival rate that, while tragic by modern standards, was unfortunately not unusual for working-class families of this period, when childhood mortality from disease, malnutrition, and the generally harsh conditions of Victorian urban poverty claimed an enormous proportion of children before they reached their 5th birthday, particularly in the crowded and often unsanitary conditions in which railway labourer families frequently lived as they followed construction work from project to project. Samuel's grandson, the man ultimately responsible for preserving and eventually publishing the family account of the Section 11 discovery, was born in the final years of the 19th century, and his own written record, compiled many decades later, based on conversations he had with Samuel during the final years of the old man's life, captures something genuinely moving about how this single incident from Samuel's youth continued to weigh upon him across the entire remainder of his life. Decades after the immediate circumstances of the discovery and reburial had faded from any practical relevance to his daily existence, the grandson's account describes Samuel as a man who rarely spoke about his railway working days in any detail, beyond occasional general comments about the harshness of the work and pride in the role he and men like him had played in building the railway network that, by the time of his old age, had become such a fundamental and unremarkable part of everyday British life that few people gave any thought to the brutal human labour that had made its construction possible. But on the specific subject of the Section 11 discovery, Samuel apparently maintained an unusual combination of reluctance and, paradoxically, a clear underlying need to eventually share what he had witnessed, a tension that the grandson's account captures with considerable sensitivity and emotional insight. According to this account, Samuel first began hinting at the existence of some significant but unspecified secret from his railway working days when his grandson was still quite young, offering only vague and incomplete references that the boy, not understanding their significance, largely failed to register or remember in any detail. It was only much later, when Samuel was in his final years and apparently sensed his own approaching death with the kind of practical clarity that often comes to elderly people who have lived hard physical lives and developed a realistic understanding of their own mortality, that he finally sat his grown grandson down and provided the detailed account that would eventually be preserved in writing. The grandson's account describes this final conversation taking place over the course of several evenings, with Samuel speaking slowly and carefully, occasionally pausing for long periods as though searching for the right words to describe events from more than half a century earlier, events that had clearly remained vivid in his memory despite the passage of so many decades. He apparently wept at certain points during this retelling, a detail the grandson includes not for dramatic effect but because it clearly made a profound impression on him, suggesting an old man who had carried genuine and lasting emotional weight from this single incident across the entire remainder of his adult life. What specifically caused Samuel such evident distress, beyond the simple mystery of what had been found, is a question the grandson's account addresses with somewhat more clarity than other aspects of the story. According to this account, Samuel's distress centered less on the structure itself and more on his own lasting uncertainty about whether his silence, maintained across an entire lifetime out of fear for his livelihood and family's economic security, had constituted some kind of moral failing, a betrayal of what he apparently came to believe, in his later years, was an obligation to the truth that he had ultimately failed to honor in favor of protecting his own and his family's immediate economic interests. This is, frankly, a remarkably poignant detail, and it speaks to something genuinely important about the human cost of institutional suppression that often gets lost when we focus primarily on the more sensational and mysterious elements of cases like this one. Samuel was not a powerful man. He possessed no institutional authority, no financial resources, no meaningful ability to resist the pressure placed upon him by his employers in 1842. His silence was, in the most practical sense, coerced, the predictable result of an enormous power imbalance between a working-class labourer, entirely dependent on his employer's goodwill for his family's survival, and a powerful corporate and institutional structure, with every incentive and every practical means to ensure his continued compliance. Yet despite this coercion, despite the genuinely understandable and arguably entirely reasonable decision he made to prioritize his family's economic security over any abstract obligation to public disclosure, Samuel apparently carried a persistent sense of guilt and moral discomfort across the remainder of his life, a burden that he ultimately sought to at least partially resolve by ensuring that the truth, as he understood and remembered it, would eventually be preserved and shared, even if only after his own death had removed any remaining personal risk to himself from finally breaking his decades-long silence. This pattern of working-class witnesses to suppress discoveries carrying genuine and lasting psychological burdens from their enforced silence appears, based on what limited comparative research exists on similar historical cases, to be a remarkably consistent feature of these kinds of institutional suppression efforts more broadly. The powerful institutions responsible for orchestrating concealment generally face minimal lasting personal consequence, their decision-making processes documented, if at all, in the kind of relatively dispassionate institutional and personal correspondence we've examined from figures like Holloway and Director R. But the working-class individuals coerced into maintaining the actual physical silence required to make such concealment effective often appear to have carried considerably more direct and lasting personal psychological weight from their involvement, a weight that, in Samuel's case at least, was ultimately only partially relieved through his decision to finally share his testimony with his own family before his death. It's worth pausing to consider what this pattern suggests about the broader and largely invisible human cost of historical suppression more generally, a cost that extends well beyond the simple loss of historical knowledge or scientific understanding that results from successful concealment efforts, and into the genuine and lasting psychological burden carried by the ordinary working people who, lacking any meaningful power to resist, become unwilling participants in the concealment of truths they themselves often recognized, at some level, as genuinely significant and deserving of wider public knowledge. To fully appreciate the world that Samuel and his fellow navvies inhabited, and to understand why the threat of dismissal carried such overwhelming coercive power over men in his position, it's worth spending some time on the broader context of what life actually looked like for the labouring men who built Britain's railway network during this extraordinary period of national transformation, a period that historians have come to call railway mania, characterised by an almost frenzied pace of construction, investment, and speculation that reshaped the British landscape more dramatically and more rapidly than perhaps any other infrastructure project in the nation's history before or since. The scale of this construction effort is genuinely difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, accustomed as we are to infrastructure projects that, while still significant, typically unfold over years of careful planning, environmental assessment, and regulatory review before construction even begins. The railway companies of the 1830s and 1840s operated within a comparatively minimal regulatory environment, driven by intense competitive pressure between rival companies racing to secure the most valuable routes and establish dominant market positions before their competitors could do the same, and financed by a speculative investment boom that, at its peak, saw an almost unimaginable proportion of British capital flowing into railway construction schemes, many of which would ultimately prove financially unsound or were never even completed once the speculative bubble inevitably began to deflate. Within this environment, the navvies, who actually performed the physical labour of construction, occupied a position of considerable vulnerability and minimal protection. These were overwhelmingly working-class men, drawn disproportionately from rural areas where agricultural employment had become increasingly precarious due to ongoing economic and social transformations affecting the British countryside, and very significantly from Ireland, where the catastrophic impact of the Great Famine, which began its most devastating phase in 1845, but had roots in agricultural and economic crises stretching back considerably earlier, drove enormous numbers of displaced and desperate workers to seek employment wherever it could be found, including on the railway construction projects then proliferating across England, Scotland, and Wales. The work itself was extraordinarily dangerous, conducted using only the most basic hand tools and relying entirely on human and animal muscle power for tasks that modern construction would accomplish using heavy machinery, with safety standards essentially non-existent by any modern measure. Cuttings collapsed, tunnels flooded, scaffolding failed, and the cumulative death toll across the entire era of Victorian railway construction, while never comprehensively documented in the way modern workplace safety records would require, is generally estimated by historians to have reached into the thousands, with serious injuries affecting a far larger proportion of the total workforce, injuries that, in an era before any meaningful workers' compensation system existed, frequently left affected men and their families facing immediate and often catastrophic loss of income, with essentially no institutional safety net to fall back upon. It's within this broader context of extreme vulnerability and minimal worker protection that we need to understand the practical reality facing Samuel and his fellow crew members when they were confronted with the choice between maintaining silence about what they had witnessed in exchange for continued employment and a modest additional payment, or risking immediate dismissal and the loss of their livelihood by attempting to publicize or otherwise resist the company's preferred course of action. For men in this position, with families depending on their wages for basic survival, and with essentially no alternative employment opportunities readily available that wouldn't require uprooting their entire family and relocating, often considerable distances, to wherever the next available construction project happened to be located. The choice to comply with their employer's demands for silence, however morally uncomfortable it might have felt, represented an almost inevitable and entirely rational response to their genuinely precarious economic circumstances. This context also helps explain why the eventual preservation and transmission of Samuel's testimony, fragile and informal as it was, depending entirely on family oral tradition rather than any kind of formal documentation or institutional record-keeping, represents such a remarkable historical survival. The vast majority of working-class testimony and experience from this period has simply been lost entirely, never recorded in any form, the natural and inevitable consequence of a society in which working-class people were rarely considered worthy of the kind of careful documentation and record preservation that was routinely extended to the correspondence, business records, and personal papers of wealthier and more socially prominent individuals, like Halloway and Director R. That Samuel's testimony survived at all, preserved through his grandson's evident care and eventual decision to commit it to writing, represents a genuine stroke of historical fortune, the kind of fortunate survival that allows us today to glimpse, however incompletely, the human experience and perspective of the actual working men who made this discovery, rather than relying entirely on the more institutionally documented, but also more emotionally distant perspectives, preserved in official company records and the private correspondence of educated, socially privileged participants in this story. This observation extends beyond the specific case of Section 11 to a broader and genuinely important point about the practice of history itself and about the kinds of historical questions and mysteries that tend to attract popular attention and sustained investigation. Cases like this one, involving dramatic discoveries, institutional suppression, and tantalizing hints of unresolved historical mystery, naturally generate considerable interest and attention. But it's worth remembering that the broader historical experience of ordinary working people, men like Samuel and the countless other navvies, whose labor literally built the infrastructure that transformed Britain into a modern industrial nation, generally receives far less attention and far less careful historical preservation than the activities and decisions of the wealthier, more socially prominent individuals who held formal institutional power, and whose papers and correspondence were, almost by default, considered worthy of careful preservation and eventual archival access. The Section 11 case, in this sense, represents something genuinely valuable beyond its specific mysterious content, precisely because it preserves, however incompletely, and however filtered through multiple layers of retelling and eventual written transcription, a genuine glimpse into the experience, the moral reasoning, and the lasting emotional impact of an extraordinary event upon the ordinary working men who actually witnessed it firsthand, men whose voices and perspectives are so frequently and so completely absent from the broader historical record of this transformative period in British history. As we move toward the closing portion of tonight's exploration, it's this human dimension of the story, alongside the genuinely unresolved historical and archaeological mystery at its center, that I think deserves our final and most careful consideration, because it speaks to something that extends well beyond the specific question of what was buried beneath that London railway cutting in 1842, and toward broader questions about how historical truth gets preserved, suppressed, and eventually, sometimes, partially recovered across the passage of decades and centuries, questions that remain genuinely relevant to how we think about historical knowledge and institutional power even today, nearly 2 centuries removed from the specific events we've spent this evening exploring together. It's worth remembering, too, that Samuel was far from unique among working people of his era in carrying this particular kind of burden. Across the whole sweep of Victorian industrial expansion, ordinary labourers were regularly placed in positions where their silence, their compliance, their willingness to simply look away from things that troubled them became the quiet and largely invisible price of their own continued survival and their families' continued security. Most of those silences, unlike Samuel's, were never eventually broken, never preserved in writing, never passed down through a grateful and attentive grandson who recognized the value of what he was being told. They simply ended with the deaths of the people who carried them, taking whatever truths those people had witnessed permanently and irretrievably out of the world. Samuel's testimony survives because of a particular combination of personal conscience and family fortune that we should recognize as genuinely rare and genuinely precious, rather than assuming it represents anything close to the typical fate of working-class historical testimony from this extraordinary and transformative century. In more recent years, particularly since the broader cataloguing and digitization of regional archives has made historical research considerably more accessible to independent researchers without formal academic affiliations, interest in the Section 11 case has experienced something of a quiet revival, driven primarily by a small but genuinely dedicated community of historical researchers, archive enthusiasts, and amateur archaeologists, who have continued to dig through whatever scattered records might still contain relevant information, hoping to add additional pieces to a puzzle that, as we've discussed throughout this evening, remains frustratingly incomplete, despite the genuine progress that has been made since Director R's notebook first came to light in the 1980s. This ongoing research has yielded a handful of additional, smaller discoveries that, while not resolving the central mystery, have at least helped to further corroborate and contextualize the core narrative we've reconstructed tonight. Researchers have located, for instance, additional fragments of correspondence between other railway company employees from this period that, while not directly referencing the Section 11 discovery by name, contain oblique references to unusual delays and unexplained personnel changes affecting that specific section of the railway line during the relevant period. References that, taken in isolation, would mean little, but that, when placed within the broader context we've established through our primary sources, provide additional small pieces of circumstantial corroboration for the basic timeline and sequence of events we've discussed. Researchers have also made some progress in identifying additional surviving descendants of other members of the original discovery crew beyond Samuel, though efforts to locate additional family oral traditions comparable to what survived through Samuel's grandson have generally proven disappointing, likely reflecting the simple reality that most families, lacking Samuel's apparent persistent need to eventually share his testimony before his death, simply allowed whatever knowledge they once possessed about this incident to fade and disappear across subsequent generations, the natural and common fate of most oral historical traditions that aren't deliberately and carefully preserved through eventual written transcription. One particularly intriguing avenue of more recent research has involved attempts to use modern geological and historical mapping techniques to better understand the precise geological context of the original discovery site, work that, while unable to provide direct physical evidence, given the impossibility of conducting actual excavation at the now heavily developed location, has at least helped to clarify some of the broader geological questions our story has raised. This research has confirmed that the depth described in our primary sources, while certainly unusual for typical Roman remains in this part of London, is not geologically implausible for a structure of considerably greater antiquity, particularly given what modern geological understanding tells us about sediment deposition rates and patterns in this specific area of the Thames Valley across the many millennia since the end of the last glacial period. This geological research doesn't prove that the structure was indeed prehistoric, rather than Roman or some other historical period, but it does at least establish that the depth at which it was found is consistent with, rather than contradictory to, the possibility of considerably greater antiquity than the Roman period, lending at least some additional circumstantial credibility to the more conservative revisionist theory we discussed earlier. The possibility that this structure might represent evidence of a previously unrecognized phase of sophisticated prehistoric British construction, predating even the well-known megalithic monument building tradition associated with sites, like Stonehenge. Beyond this geological context, more recent research has also attempted, with only limited success, to track down whether any additional physical evidence from the original discovery might have survived somewhere, whether in the form of additional sketches, samples, or artifacts that might have been removed from the site during the more thorough final examination that Samuel's second-hand account and JT's memoir both suggest occurred before the structure's ultimate reburial. This search has focused particularly on the possibility that materials might exist within the archives or collections of whatever specific institution actually sent representatives to examine and ultimately order the concealment of the discovery, though as we've discussed, the precise identity of this institution remains a matter of informed speculation rather than definitive confirmation. Researchers have conducted preliminary inquiries with several of the most plausible candidate institutions, including the Society of Antiquaries and the Geological Society of London, both of which maintain extensive historical archives covering this exact period. These inquiries have, thus far, failed to identify any clearly relevant material, though it's worth noting that the archives of institutions of this age and scale are frequently enormous, only partially catalogued in detail, and not always organized in ways that would make a search for material related to a specific and relatively obscure incident, like Section 11, straightforward, even for researchers working with full institutional cooperation and access. The possibility that relevant material exists within these archives, simply not yet identified or properly catalogued, cannot be ruled out, and represents one of the more promising, if frustratingly slow and uncertain, avenues for potential future progress on this case. It's also worth acknowledging, in the interest of complete intellectual honesty, that the Section 11 case has, like many historical mysteries that achieve a degree of popular attention, attracted its share of less rigorous speculation and outright embellishment in more recent years, particularly as the story has circulated more widely through online discussion forums, amateur history podcasts, and the kind of speculative documentary content that has proliferated considerably as online video platforms have made it increasingly easy for anyone, regardless of their research rigor or historical training, to produce and distribute content exploring historical mysteries of this nature. Some of this more recent speculative material has introduced additional claimed details, alleged additional witnesses, and increasingly elaborate theories regarding the structure's origin and purpose that go considerably beyond what our actual primary sources, limited and imperfect as they admittedly are, can genuinely support. We've made a deliberate effort throughout tonight's exploration to focus specifically on what can be reasonably traced back to Samuel's family account, Halloway's preserved correspondence, J.T.'s memoir, and Director R's notebook, treating these four sources as the genuine evidentiary core of this case, while being explicit about which details remain more speculative, more difficult to verify, or more dependent on a single uncorroborated source, rather than presenting the more embellished and less well-supported versions of this story that have unfortunately become increasingly common, as the case has attracted wider popular attention without a corresponding increase in rigorous historical scrutiny. This distinction matters, I think, not because the more speculative and embellished versions of historical mysteries are inherently without value or interest, but because there's a meaningful difference between acknowledging genuine uncertainty and unresolved mystery, which is exactly the honest position this case warrants given our actual surviving evidence, and presenting speculative or unverified claims with a false confidence that obscures just how much about this case genuinely remains unknown and quite possibly, given the physical destruction and burial of the primary evidence itself, may simply remain unknown and unknowable for the foreseeable future, regardless of how much additional documentary research might eventually be conducted. There's a particular kind of unease that settles over you when you spend enough time studying a case like this one, an unease that has very little to do with any genuinely paranormal or supernatural quality the story might possess, and considerably more to do with a quieter and more persistent recognition of just how much of our collective human history has likely been lost, not through the simple and unavoidable erosion of time, but through deliberate human choices made by people who decided, for whatever combination of genuine and self-serving reasons that certain truths were better left buried. We tend to imagine history as a kind of accumulating record, imperfect and incomplete in places due to the simple ravages of time, lost documents, decayed artifacts, and the inevitable fading of oral tradition across generations, but fundamentally moving in a direction of ever-increasing knowledge and understanding as new techniques and new discoveries continue to add to our collective picture of the past. And in many respects, this is genuinely true. Modern archaeological and historical methodology has revealed an extraordinary amount about human history that would have been entirely unknown or unknowable to researchers working even a century ago, and the ongoing process of discovery, particularly as new technologies like ground-penetrating radar, genetic analysis, and increasingly sophisticated dating techniques continue to develop, shows no signs of slowing. But the Section 11 case reminds us, I think, that this comfortable narrative of steadily accumulating knowledge isn't the entire picture. Some truths, particularly truths that threatened established power structures, religious orthodoxies, or commercial interests at the moment of their discovery, were not simply lost through the passive erosion of time, but were actively buried, in this case quite literally, by people who possessed both the institutional power and the practical means to ensure that inconvenient discoveries simply disappeared from public knowledge, sometimes so effectively that it would take nearly a century and a half and a considerable degree of historical fortune before even fragmentary evidence of what had actually happened began to resurface. How many other discoveries, similar in nature to what those navvies found beneath the London clay in 1842, have simply vanished entirely from any surviving record, with no equivalent of Samuel's persistent need to eventually confess what he had witnessed, no equivalent of Director R's apparent guilt, driving him to preserve documentation that he hoped future generations might eventually access, no fortunate chain of archival preservation and eventual rediscovery, comparable to what allowed researchers to finally piece together this particular story. It's a genuinely unsettling question, and one that, by its very nature, admits no definitive answer, since we are, almost by definition, unable to know what we don't know, unable to fully appreciate the scope of historical knowledge that may have been permanently and irrecoverably lost through similar acts of deliberate concealment that simply weren't fortunate enough to leave behind the kind of fragmentary trail of evidence that allowed the Section 11 story to eventually be reconstructed, however incompletely, by later researchers. This question extends, I think, beyond simply this single case, and beyond even the broader pattern of Victorian-era institutional suppression that we've discussed throughout tonight's exploration, and toward a more fundamental and frankly somewhat humbling recognition about the inherent limitations of historical knowledge more generally. We tend to treat the historical record, the accumulated body of documented and verified facts about the past that professional historians and archaeologists have carefully assembled through generations of rigorous research, as though it represents something approaching a complete and objective account of what actually happened throughout human history. But the Section 11 case, and the broader pattern of similar suppressed discoveries that researchers have identified across this same general period, reminds us that the historical record is, in reality, a profoundly incomplete and selectively preserved account, shaped not just by the random and unavoidable processes of decay and loss that affect any physical and documentary record over time, but by deliberate human choices about what should and shouldn't be preserved, investigated, and shared with wider public knowledge, choices that were frequently made by people with specific institutional interests and ideological commitments that shaped which discoveries received careful documentation and continued investigation, and which were instead quietly suppressed and, when circumstances allowed, literally buried beneath the earth from which they had only briefly and accidentally emerged. This recognition doesn't require us to embrace any kind of sweeping or paranoid conspiracy theory about systematic historical falsification, a framing that, frankly, tends to oversimplify what was clearly, even in the specific case of Section 11, a considerably messier and more morally ambiguous process involving genuine scientific caution alongside institutional self-interest, individual moral discomfort alongside collective institutional pressure, and outcomes that even some of the original participants, like Director R, came to view with considerable personal unease and regret as they reflected on what had actually occurred compared to what they had originally understood and agreed to support. What it does require, I think, is a more humble and more genuinely curious approach to historical knowledge generally, an approach that remains open to the genuine possibility that our current understanding of human history, however well supported by the extensive and continuously growing body of archaeological and documentary evidence that professional historians have carefully assembled, remains incomplete in ways we can't always anticipate or fully appreciate, shaped not just by what has been discovered and preserved, but by what was, for whatever combination of reasons, decided long ago by people with power and influence that we as a society would be better off not knowing. The men who buried that structure beneath the London clay in 1842 are long dead now, along with everyone who witnessed the discovery firsthand, everyone who participated in the decision to conceal it, and everyone who carried out the actual physical labor of reburying what those navvies had accidentally uncovered. Whatever they knew, whatever they saw, whatever genuine understanding they might have developed about the true nature and origin of that structure during their brief and carefully controlled examination before its final concealment, died quietly with them, preserved only in the fragmentary and imperfect form we've spent this evening carefully reconstructing from the scattered pieces of evidence that happened, through a combination of individual conscience and historical fortune, to survive across the subsequent decades and centuries. Somewhere beneath the modern infrastructure of London, beneath layers of subsequent construction and nearly 2 centuries of continued urban development, that structure, whatever it actually was, and whoever actually built it, very likely still remains, exactly where those gentlemen ordered it reburied on that night in 1842, waiting, perhaps, for some future generation, possessing both the technological capability and the institutional will to finally and properly investigate what those frightened and silenced navvies first discovered in the darkness, 40 feet beneath a city that, even today, has still not fully reckoned with the question of exactly how old its own foundations, in every sense of that word, might actually turn out to be. There's one more small but telling detail worth including before we close this story out, a detail that emerged only recently during the most current phase of archival research into this case, and that adds a final, quietly haunting texture to everything we've discussed tonight. Researchers cross-referencing weather and tidal records from the autumn of 1842, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that Victorian institutions, ironically, were often far more diligent about preserving than they were about preserving records of inconvenient archaeological discoveries. We notice something curious about the specific night the reburial is believed to have taken place. According to these records, that particular night coincided with an unusually low tide on the Thames, a detail that, on its own, might mean nothing at all. But when cross-referenced against Director R's notebook, which mentions in passing, almost as an aside, that the final examination and reburial needed to be timed carefully due to what he vaguely describes as conditions affecting the lower excavation, a phrase he never fully explains, it raises the intriguing possibility that water table levels in the area, closely tied to the Thames tidal cycle, given the proximity of the site to the river, and the porous gravel layers we discussed earlier in our exploration of the local geology, played some practical role in determining exactly when the final work could safely be conducted. This is, admittedly, a small and somewhat technical detail, but I find it oddly moving precisely because of its mundane practicality. Whatever genuinely extraordinary thing those navvies and engineers were dealing with that autumn, whatever ancient mystery sat exposed in that excavation, the actual mechanics of concealing it were still governed by the same unglamorous, physical realities that governed every other piece of Victorian engineering work: water tables, tidal cycles, the simple, stubborn behavior of London clay when saturated versus when relatively dry. The extraordinary and the utterly mundane sat side by side in that cutting, the way they so often do in real historical events, which rarely unfold with the clean, dramatic shape that storytelling naturally wants to impose upon them. I think that detail is worth sitting with for a moment as we close tonight's exploration, because it's a useful reminder that history, Even history this strange and this carefully buried was made by real people dealing with real, unglamorous, practical constraints. Men checking tide tables and worrying about groundwater seepage, even as they carried out instructions to conceal something that may genuinely rewrite our understanding of who built what and when, in the deep and largely unrecorded span of human prehistory. The sublime and the mundane, tangled together in the London clay, exactly the way they tend to be tangled together in almost every genuinely true story, once you dig past the more polished and more dramatic versions that tend to circulate once a story like this one begins to spread. It's also worth noting, as a final point of comparison, that the Section 11 case does not stand entirely alone within the broader historical record of 19th century Britain, even if it remains among the most thoroughly documented examples of its kind that researchers have managed to reconstruct painstakingly, fragment by fragment, piece by careful piece, across nearly 2 centuries of patient, scattered, and often frustrating archival work. A handful of other fragmentary accounts, scattered across regional archives in the north of England and in lowland Scotland, describe broadly similar patterns during this same general era of intensive canal and railway excavation, labourers encountering unexplained stonework at unusual depths, work being abruptly halted, and a subsequent and remarkably consistent pattern of company silence descending over the affected site within a matter of days. None of these other cases have been documented with anything approaching the level of corroborating detail we've been able to assemble tonight regarding Section 11, and in most instances, the surviving evidence amounts to little more than a single brief and ambiguous reference buried within an otherwise unremarkable local history pamphlet or parish record. But their mere existence, scattered as they are across different regions, different companies, and in some cases different decades entirely, suggests that whatever happened beneath that London cutting in 1842 may not have been a singular, isolated anomaly, but rather one visible and unusually well-preserved example of a considerably broader and largely unexamined pattern, a pattern of accidental discovery and deliberate concealment that likely played out, in smaller and less thoroughly documented ways, at construction sites scattered across the length and breadth of Britain throughout this entire extraordinary century of digging, building, and quietly burying whatever inconvenient truths the earth occasionally chose to give back. As we come to the close of tonight's journey, I want to leave you with one final image, one that Samuel himself apparently described to his grandson during those final evenings of testimony, an image that has stayed with me since I first encountered this case, more than any of the institutional intrigue or unresolved archaeological mystery we've spent the last several hours carefully unpacking together. Samuel described the moment, just before the final reburial began, when he was permitted, along with a handful of the other original Discovery crew, to take one last look down into the cutting before the work of concealment commenced in earnest. He stood at the edge, lamp in hand, looking down at stone that had waited in darkness for what he somehow understood, even without any formal education in geology or archaeology, must have been an almost unimaginably long span of time. Stone that had been carefully shaped and fitted by hands, belonging to people whose names, whose language, whose entire civilization had vanished so completely that not even a whisper of their existence had survived in any record, any legend, any fragment of accumulated human memory that had reached his own 19th century world. He described feeling in that moment a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with the physical depth of the cutting itself, but with the sudden and overwhelming recognition of how very small his own brief life, his own century, his own entire understanding of history and human civilization actually was when measured against whatever span of time had passed since those stones were first set carefully into place by builders whose very existence official history had no record of and no explanation for. He said it made him feel, in his own words as recorded by his grandson, like a single grain of sand trying to comprehend the size of the beach it belonged to, a metaphor that, for an uneducated railway labourer working by lamplight in a dangerous Victorian excavation, strikes me as genuinely and quietly profound. That feeling, I think, is ultimately what makes stories like this one so enduringly compelling. regardless of whether we ever manage to resolve the specific factual questions about what exactly was found and who exactly built it. It's the reminder, delivered through a real and carefully documented historical incident, rather than through speculation or fiction, that the past is very likely far stranger, far older, and far less completely understood than our comfortable modern assumptions generally allow us to believe, and that somewhere beneath the streets we walk every day, beneath the cities we've built and rebuilt across so many generations, there may well be other structures, other stories, other pieces of the deep human past waiting in the darkness, patient and silent, for someone with the courage and the curiosity to finally bring them back into the light. Whether that ever happens for the structure beneath the old Section 11 cutting, whether some future excavation, some future technological breakthrough, some future change in institutional priorities finally allows researchers to properly investigate what those frightened navvies found in 1842 is impossible to know. But the story itself, preserved against considerable odds through the persistence and conscience of a few individuals scattered across nearly 2 centuries, Samuel and his grandson, Halloway, in his careful and increasingly troubled correspondence, Director R, in his private notebook, even the obscure and only partially verifiable J.T., with his privately printed memoir, stands as its own quiet testament to the idea that even the most carefully orchestrated efforts at historical suppression rarely succeed completely, that some thread of truth, however thin and however fragmentary, almost always manages to survive, waiting patiently across however many decades it takes for the right combination of curiosity, archival fortune, and careful research to finally bring it back into the light where it belongs. If tonight's story has given your mind something gentle to wander through as you drift towards sleep, that's exactly what I hope these long, quiet explorations can offer. There's something deeply calming, I think, about losing yourself in a mystery this old, this patient, this far removed from the immediate pressures and anxieties of your own day. The structure beneath that London clay has waited nearly 2 centuries since those navvies first found it, and it will likely wait a good deal longer still. There's no urgency in it, no deadline, nothing demanding your attention right this moment. Just an old, quiet question, settled into the dark, content to be wondered about slowly, the way you might wonder about it now, as your own thoughts begin to soften and slow towards sleep. If you've enjoyed tonight's journey into one of London's strangest and most carefully buried historical mysteries, you're welcome to tap the like button, simply as a small signal that stories like this one are worth continuing to tell. You can subscribe if you'd like to join me for more of these long, slow explorations into forgotten history, suppressed discoveries, and the quiet mysteries that still sit beneath the surface of places we think we already know completely. I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city, what country, what time it happens to be where you are right now, because there's something quietly wonderful about knowing that people scattered across so many different time zones are drifting off to sleep together, carried along by the same strange story about a hole in the London ground that was never supposed to be spoken of again. If you'd like to support this channel in a more direct way, there is an optional membership available here on YouTube, entirely up to you, with absolutely no pressure attached. It simply helps make it possible to keep researching and producing these longer, more carefully researched explorations into the stranger corners of history. But whether you choose to do that or not, simply being here tonight, letting this story carry you gently towards sleep, is more than enough. For now, there's nothing more you need to do. You don't need to remember every detail of Samuel's testimony, or Halloway's careful and troubled letters, or Director R's quiet private regret recorded in a notebook that sat unread for nearly a century. You can simply let it all settle, let the images soften, the cutting in the London clay, the lamplight flickering against ancient stone, the curve of a wall that shouldn't have existed, the patient darkness that has held its secret for nearly 200 years and seems entirely content to hold it a while longer. Somewhere beneath the modern streets of London tonight, that old stone is still resting exactly where it was left, undisturbed, unexplained, and quietly waiting. And you, wherever you are right now, can rest too. Let your thoughts grow heavy and slow. Let the mystery stay unsolved for one more night, because some questions are gentler to fall asleep with than to answer. Rest well, And I'll see you again soon for another story, another quiet hole in the ground somewhere, another stubborn fragment of truth waiting patiently in the dark for its own turn to finally, gently, be heard. Before we let this story rest entirely, I want to return briefly to a thread we touched on earlier and never fully resolved, because it adds one final layer of texture to this case that I think deserves a place in our closing reflections. That thread concerns the mysterious figure Holloway, referred to only as W, the antiquarian acquaintance who visited the site, examined the stonework, and warned Holloway that the matter would soon be taken out of his hands, a warning that, as we now know, proved entirely accurate. Researchers who have spent considerable time with this case have noted that Victorian Britain, despite its outward appearance of rigid institutional consensus regarding history, religion, and the natural sciences, actually contained a surprisingly active and surprisingly well-networked community of amateur scholars, gentlemen antiquarians, and informally trained researchers who corresponded with one another across considerable distances, sharing observations, theories, and sometimes genuinely heterodox ideas about history and the natural world that sat well outside the boundaries of what official institutions, like the established church or the more conservative scientific societies, were willing to formally sanction or publish. This informal network functioned almost like an underground current running beneath the more visible and more carefully documented official scientific and religious establishment, a space where individuals with genuine curiosity and genuine willingness to consider unconventional possibilities could exchange ideas with somewhat greater freedom than the more public and more institutionally constrained channels of formal scholarship allowed. It was within exactly this kind of informal network that someone like W, whoever he ultimately was, would have developed the comparative knowledge that allowed him to recognize, even from a brief and informal examination, that the Section 11 stonework bore similarities to construction techniques documented by explorers and travelers in distant parts of the world, techniques associated with ancient and unidentified civilizations that mainstream Victorian scholarship was only beginning to seriously grapple with during this exact period. This broader context matters because it suggests that the suppression of the Section 11 discovery, however effective it ultimately proved at the level of public knowledge and official institutional record, may not have been quite as complete as the surviving documentary evidence initially suggests. If W existed, and if he was indeed connected to this kind of informal antiquarian network, it's entirely plausible that knowledge of the discovery, in some form, circulated quietly within these unofficial scholarly circles for some time after the official suppression effort began, discussed in private correspondence and informal gatherings that left little or no trace in the kind of institutional archives that researchers studying this case have primarily relied upon. This raises the tantalizing possibility that additional, currently unknown references to the Section 11 discovery might exist scattered within the private papers and correspondence of other gentlemen antiquarians active during this period. References that simply haven't yet been connected to this specific case by researchers who may not even be aware that such a connection exists, since the relevant private archives, where they survive at all, are scattered across countless private and institutional collections throughout Britain, the vast majority never having been searched specifically with this particular incident in mind. It's worth noting, too, that this informal antiquarian underground would eventually play a quietly significant role in the broader intellectual transformation that occurred over the following decades, as the accumulating weight of geological and archaeological evidence gradually forced even the most conservative elements of the scientific and religious establishment to acknowledge that human history extended considerably further back than traditional biblical chronology had allowed, a transformation that, by the final decades of the 19th century, had fundamentally reshaped how educated society understood humanity's place within the broader span of natural and geological time. Many of the individuals who contributed to this gradual shift in understanding had spent years, sometimes decades, quietly exchanging observations and theories through exactly the kind of informal correspondence networks that W appears to have belonged to, long before their ideas found wider acceptance within the more formal and more conservative institutional channels of mainstream Victorian science. Whether the Section 11 discovery itself played any meaningful role in this broader intellectual transformation, whether knowledge of it, however incomplete and however carefully guarded, contributed in some small way to the growing private recognition among informed observers that conventional historical chronology was due for substantial revision is impossible to determine with any confidence based on the surviving evidence. But it's a genuinely intriguing possibility, and one that adds a final layer of historical resonance to this story, suggesting that even a discovery as thoroughly and effectively suppressed at the official level as Section 11 may still have left subtle and largely untraceable ripples within the broader currents of Victorian intellectual life, ripples that contributed, in whatever small and unmeasurable way, to the eventual and inevitable recognition that the story of human history was considerably longer, considerably stranger, and considerably less completely understood than the comfortable assumptions of any single century, including our own, are ever likely to fully capture. And perhaps that's the most honest note to end on tonight. Not a resolution, because this case offers none, but a recognition that the truth, once it exists, has a stubborn way of persisting even when powerful people decide it shouldn't, surviving in fragments, in private letters tucked away in family archives, in notebooks that sit unread for 100 years, in stories passed quietly from grandfather to grandson in the final years of a long life, waiting patiently for someone, somewhere, eventually to listen. That waiting is nearly over now, at least for tonight. The stone is still down there, in the dark, beneath the city that grew up and forgot it was ever found. And you, drifting now toward your own quiet rest, can let that thought settle gently rather than urgently, the way you might let a half-remembered dream settle just before sleep finally takes you all the way under. Good night.